My name is Haley. I am 33 years old, and I was just a woman hired to clean a billionaire penthouse. But when I saw the portrait on his wall, my heart stopped. It was a boy I grew up with in a Colorado orphanage, someone I had not seen since I was 8 years old. When I told the billionaire that I knew the boy in the painting, the powerful man turned pale and begged me to tell him everything. What he did not know was that the family who adopted me had just destroyed my life, and this discovery would be my ultimate revenge. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever been betrayed by the people who were supposed to protect you. The absolute destruction of my life happened on a Tuesday night at one of the most expensive restaurants in Los Angeles. The crystal chandeliers cast a heavy golden glow over the private dining room, where my adoptive family was hosting a lavish rehearsal dinner for my adoptive sister Vanessa. She was 30 years old and marrying a man from a tremendously wealthy family. The tables were covered in white silk and imported orchids. Waiters in crisp uniforms poured champagne that cost more than my weekly grocery budget. I sat at the far end of the table wearing a simple black dress, feeling completely invisible. I had spent the last 5 years pouring my blood, sweat, and tears into building my company, Elite Estate Care. It was a premium cleaning and property management service for high-end homes. I worked 14-hour days, scrubbing floors, managing staff, and building a client list from absolute scratch. I did it because I wanted to prove my worth. I desperately wanted to show my adoptive parents, Thomas and Barbara, that bringing me home from that Colorado orphanage had been a good investment. But that night, as I watched Vanessa hold up her diamond ring for her friends to admire, my phone buzzed in my purse. It was an urgent alert from my business banking application. I slipped the phone onto my lap under the tablecloth and opened the message. My heart slammed against my ribs. A withdrawal of $150,000 had just cleared from my company reserve fund. That money was my safety net, the funds I needed to cover my payroll, my taxes, and my upcoming equipment upgrades. Without it, my business would literally collapse within weeks. My hands shook violently as I opened the transaction details. The transfer had been authorized by Thomas. A cold wave of nausea washed over me. When I first started my company, I was young and naive. Thomas had insisted on putting his name on the foundational corporate documents as a guarantor, claiming it would help me secure better business loans. I had trusted him implicitly. He was my father. I never imagined he would use that old legal loophole to drain my accounts dry and steal everything I had built. I looked down the long dining table. Thomas was laughing loudly, swirling a glass of expensive red wine. Barbara sat next to him, wearing a brand new designer necklace, beaming with pride at Vanessa. They looked so incredibly happy, so utterly unbothered by the fact that they had just stolen my entire livelihood. I could not breathe. I stood up my chair, scraping loudly against the polished hardwood floor. The sound cut through the elegant chatter of the room. Several wealthy guests turned to look at me, their faces expressing mild annoyance at the sudden interruption. I did not care. I walked straight toward the head of the table where my adoptive parents sat. "Thomas, I need to speak with you right now," I said. My voice was low, but it trembled with a rage I could barely contain. Thomas looked up at me, his smile fading into a look of absolute disdain. "Haley, can you not see we are celebrating your sister? Sit down and stop making a scene." "I am not sitting down," I replied, stepping closer. "You just drained $150,000 from my business account. That is my payroll money. That is everything I have worked for. Where is it?" The silence that fell over the dining room was suffocating. The clinking of silverware stopped completely. Vanessa lowered her champagne glass, her eyes narrowing as she glared at me. Barbara sighed heavily, adjusting her silk shawl with deliberate slowness. "Do not be so dramatic, Haley. We needed the funds for the wedding. The floral arrangements and the venue upgrades were more expensive than we anticipated. You should be happy to contribute to your sister's special day." Contribute. I repeated the word, tasting like ash in my mouth. "You did not ask for a contribution. You stole my company reserves. You used a legal loophole to rob me blind. My business will go bankrupt without that money. My employees will not get paid." Thomas slammed his hand flat on the table, making the crystal glasses rattle. Watch your tone when you speak to us. That money is family money. I helped you set up that little cleaning business, and as your father, I have every right to allocate resources where the family needs them most. Vanessa is marrying into a prominent family. This wedding is an investment in our future. Your future, I shot back, not mine. You have never supported my business. You called me a glorified maid. You mocked me for cleaning houses while Vanessa got her expensive degrees paid for. And now you steal the money I scrubbed floors to earn just to buy more flowers for a party. The moment those words left my mouth, Barbara stood up. Before I could even process her movement, her hand cracked across my cheek. The slap echoed through the silent dining room like a gunshot. My head snapped to the side. A sharp, stinging pain radiated across my face, and the metallic taste of blood filled my mouth where my teeth had bitten the inside of my cheek. I stood frozen, my hand rising to touch my burning skin. You ungrateful little brat! Barbara hissed, her voice vibrating with pure malice. Her carefully maintained socialite persona dropped, completely revealing the cruel woman I had known behind closed doors my entire life. You owe this family your very life. If it were not for us, you would still be a rat starving in that rundown Colorado orphanage. We fed you, we clothed you, we gave you a respectable name. You belong to us. Everything you have belongs to this house. Paying for the wedding is the absolute least you can do to repay the massive debt you owe us for saving your pathetic life. The sheer toxicity of her words paralyzed me. For 25 years, I had internalized that exact message. I had worked myself to the bone trying to prove I was worthy of their charity. I had swallowed their insults, accepted their leftover affection, and convinced myself that family required sacrifice. But standing there feeling the physical sting of her hand on my face, the illusion finally shattered. They did not save me. They had simply purchased a scapegoat. You did not adopt a daughter, I whispered, my voice thick with unshed tears. You adopted a servant. Vanessa grabbed her glass of red wine from the table. Before I could step back, she threw the contents directly into my face. The dark crimson liquid splashed across my eyes, stinging and blinding me momentarily. It dripped down my nose, stained my pale skin, and soaked instantly into the fabric of my dress. Get out of my rehearsal dinner! Vanessa screamed, her voice echoing off the walls. You are a disgusting, selfish loser. Go back to your miserable little life and do not ever show your face around my new family again. You are socially unfit to even be in the same room as us. Go find another table. Better yet, go find another family. I stood there dripping with wine, my cheek throbbing, completely humiliated, in front of dozens of wealthy guests who were watching me with a mixture of shock and disgust. Waiters hovered awkwardly near the walls, unsure if they should intervene. My parents did not look sorry. Thomas adjusted his tie, looking satisfied. Barbara glared at me with absolute contempt. They expected me to cry. They expected me to break down, apologize, and beg for their forgiveness, just like I had done when I was a terrified 8-year-old girl, afraid of being sent back to the orphanage. But I was not that little girl anymore. I wiped the wine from my eyes, using the back of my hand. I looked at Barbara, then at Thomas, and finally at Vanessa. I did not scream. I did not cry. I simply nodded slowly, the final thread of my loyalty snapping completely. You are right, I said, my voice eerily calm despite the adrenaline rushing through my veins. I do not belong in this family. Keep the money. Consider it the final payment for my purchase price. Because from this second forward, I no longer have parents, and I no longer have a sister. I turned my back on them and walked toward the exit. My heels clicked steadily against the hardwood floor. I held my head high, refusing to let anyone see the tears that threatened to fall. I walked out of the private dining room, through the main restaurant, and pushed through the heavy glass doors into the cool Los Angeles night. The valets stared at me as I walked past them, my dress ruined and my face stained red, but I did not stop. I walked down the busy sidewalk, the sounds of the city rushing around me. My phone buzzed in my purse again, a grim reminder of the zero balance in my business account. I had lost everything. The family I had tried so hard to please had destroyed my livelihood in a matter of seconds. I had no money to pay my rent, no money to pay my staff, and no safety net to fall back on. I was completely and utterly alone in the world, just as I had been before they found me. But as the cool night air dried the wine on my skin, a new feeling began to replace the despair. It was a cold, hard resolve. They thought they had ruined me. They thought taking my money would force me to crawl back to them in defeat. They severely underestimated my ability to survive. I had built elite estate care from nothing, and if I had to, I would do it again. I would take whatever jobs I needed. I would scrub the floors of the wealthy elite myself if it meant keeping my independence. The very next morning, desperate to keep my company afloat, I took on a high-paying emergency cleaning contract that none of my staff were available to handle. It was a massive penthouse suite belonging to a notoriously private billionaire named Richard Montgomery. I packed my cleaning supplies, put on my uniform, and rode the service elevator to the top floor of his luxury tower, completely unaware that stepping through his front doors would lead me straight to a ghost from my past and hand me the ultimate weapon to destroy the family who had just thrown me away. The service elevator door slid open, revealing a private foyer clad in dark marble. I stepped out, gripping my cleaning cart so tightly my knuckles turned white. My body ached from a sleepless night, but the crushing weight of my financial reality pushed me forward. Elite estate care was bleeding out. Without the $150,000 Thomas had stolen, I could not cover the invoices due by Friday. I had spent the morning fielding calls from panicked vendors and dodging inquiries from my staff. Taking this emergency cleaning job at Richard Montgomery Penthouse was a desperate act of survival. I needed the premium rate to buy myself a few more days of operation. The penthouse was staggeringly massive. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the Los Angeles skyline, bathed in the harsh midday sun. I put on my gloves and began the grueling work. I scrubbed the imported Italian tile in the master bathroom until my shoulders burned. I polished the vast expanses of glass in the living room, trying to ignore the gnawing hunger in my stomach. Every swipe of my cloth was fueled by a mixture of deep sorrow and simmering rage. My adoptive family had discarded me with a cruelty that still made my chest tight, but I refused to break. I moved systematically through the sprawling residence, focusing entirely on the physical labor to keep the despair at bay. 2 hours into the job, I pushed my cart down a long hallway leading to the private study. The walls here were different from the rest of the modern minimalist penthouse. They were lined with expensive artwork and framed photographs. I dusted the frames carefully, treating each piece with professional respect. As I moved toward the end of the corridor, I stopped dead in my tracks. The spray bottle slipped from my hand and hit the hardwood floor with a sharp crack. Liquid pooled around my shoes, but I could not look down. My eyes were completely locked on a large oil painting hanging in a gilded frame at the center of the wall. It was a portrait of a young boy. He had unruly dark hair, a defiant set to his jaw, and a very distinct small scar just above his left eyebrow. His eyes held a mixture of fierce protectiveness and deep vulnerability. The breath left my lungs in a sudden rush. I stepped closer, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I knew that face. I knew that scar. I knew those eyes better than I knew my own reflection. Memories from a lifetime ago flooded my mind with blinding clarity. The biting cold of the Colorado winters, the damp, drafty halls of the orphanage, the harsh voices of the caretakers, and Leo, the boy who used to share his meager portions of bread with me when I was crying from hunger. The boy who stood between me and the older bullies taking blows that were meant for me. We were inseparable. We created a secret code, carving symbols into the peeling paint behind the orphanage boiler room. He was my protector, my only friend, and the only family I truly had before Thomas and Barbara arrived to take me away. I vividly remembered the day I was adopted. I was crying, reaching out for Leo from the back seat of the shiny car. He ran after the vehicle until he could not keep up anymore, his dark hair flying in the wind. I never saw him again. For 25 years, I assumed he had faded into the broken foster system like so many other children. Yet here he was, immortalized in a masterpiece painting hanging in the private penthouse of a Los Angeles billionaire. My mind could not process the connection. The shock paralyzed my vocal cords for a long moment. I reached out a trembling hand, lightly tracing the air inches away from the canvas. "Sir, that boy lived with me in the orphanage," I cried out. My voice echoed loudly down the quiet hallway, breaking the absolute silence of the penthouse. A heavy oak door down the hall flew open. Richard Montgomery stumbled out of his private study. He was a man in his late 60s, usually known for his imposing stature and ruthless business acumen. But right now he looked incredibly fragile. His face had drained of all color, leaving him pale and shaking. He wore a crisp suit, but his tie was loosened and his eyes were wide with a desperate, frantic energy. He closed the distance between us in 3 long strides, completely ignoring the puddle of cleaning fluid on the floor. He grabbed my shoulders with a grip so tight it bruised. "What did you just say?" he demanded, his voice cracking with raw emotion. "Tell me exactly what you just said." I flinched slightly, but held my ground, maintaining eye contact with the desperate billionaire. "I said I know him," I replied, my voice steadying. "That boy in the painting. We grew up together in a Colorado orphanage. His name is Leo. He has a small scar above his left eye from falling against a radiator when he was 6. Richard let go of my shoulders and stumbled backward, leaning heavily against the corridor wall, as if his legs could no longer support him. A ragged sob tore from his throat. He covered his face with his hands, his broad shoulders shaking violently. For a moment I did not know what to do. I stood there awkwardly, watching one of the most powerful men in the city break down completely. When he finally lowered his hands, his eyes were bloodshot, but filled with a burning, intense hope. "His name is Leo Montgomery," he whispered, wiping a tear from his cheek. "He is my grandson, my only grandson." He motioned for me to follow him into the study. The room was dark, filled with leather-bound books and stacks of private investigation files. Richard poured himself a glass of water with shaking hands. He sank into a heavy leather chair and began to explain a tragedy that mirrored the cruelty of my own past. 20 years ago, Richard lost his daughter in a tragic accident. Her husband, a bitter and vindictive man, blamed Richard for the incident. Driven by pure spite, the son-in-law kidnapped little Leo and vanished without a trace. Richard had spent the last 2 decades hiring the best private investigators in the world, spending tens of millions of dollars chasing false leads and dead ends. The son-in-law had deliberately dumped Leo into the most obscure corners of the foster care system, under a false name, just to ensure Richard would never find his heir. "I have searched every corner of this country," Richard said, his voice heavy with years of accumulated grief. "I have offered a $5 million reward to anyone who can bring me verifiable proof of his location. People have tried to scam me. People have brought me fake DNA tests and fabricated stories. But you—" He looked at me with piercing clarity. "You knew about the scar. You knew his name was Leo. The investigators only found out he might have been sent to Colorado a month ago. You are the very first real lead I have had in 20 years. He stood up and walked toward a large safe in the corner of the room. "I will write you a check right now," he said urgently. "I will give you $1 million today as an advance on the $5 million reward if you can just give me the exact name and location of that orphanage. Tell me everything you know. Name your price, Haley." The mention of money made my heart skip a beat. $1 million would not just save elite estate care, it would secure my future forever. I would never have to worry about Thomas and Barbara again. I could walk away from their toxic shadow and build an empire. The temptation was incredibly strong, but as I looked at Richard, I did not see a billionaire offering me a payout. I saw a broken family member desperately trying to find the missing piece of his heart. I saw the same desperate longing I had felt every single night in that orphanage, wishing someone would come looking for me. I shook my head slowly, pushing the thought of the money aside. "Put your checkbook away, Mr. Montgomery," I said firmly. "I do not want your money. I will help you find Leo unconditionally. He was my protector when I had no one else. Helping bring him home is the absolute least I can do." Richard stared at me, utterly speechless. In his world, everyone wanted a payout. My refusal to take the money clearly shocked him to his core. I do not remember the exact address of the orphanage, I explained, breaking the stunned silence. I was only 8 years old when they took me away, but I kept a detailed journal. I wrote down everything about those days. The name of the facility, the names of the caretakers, the exact dates Leo and I were there together. I even have a small drawing he made for me. It is all safely locked away in a box at my apartment. Richard grabbed my hands, pressing them between his own in a gesture of profound gratitude. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice breaking again. "You have no idea what this means to me. Please go get the journal. My driver will take you. We will start the search immediately." I stripped off my cleaning gloves and left the penthouse, feeling a sudden surge of adrenaline. My own problems temporarily faded into the background. I had a mission. I was going to find the only true friend I ever had. I rode the elevator down to the lobby and rushed out to the waiting town car. But as the driver navigated the heavy Los Angeles traffic toward my modest apartment complex, a strange sense of unease settled in my stomach. I hurried up the concrete stairs to my floor, my keys already in hand. When I reached my front door, my blood turned to ice. The heavy deadbolt was completely shattered. The door frame was splintered, and the door itself hung slightly ajar. Someone had broken into my home. I pushed the splintered door open. The interior of my modest one-bedroom apartment was a disaster zone. The cheap sofa cushions were slashed open with white stuffing scattered across the cheap laminate floor like dirty snow. The kitchen drawers were yanked out and their contents dumped in a chaotic pile of silverware and takeout menus. My heart hammered against my ribs as I stepped over a broken lamp. This was not a random burglary. My cheap television was still sitting on the stand. My laptop was still on the kitchen counter. A random thief would have grabbed the electronics first. Whoever did this was looking for something specific. I ran straight to my bedroom, ignoring the mess in the hallway. My closet doors were flung wide open. My clothes were thrown everywhere. I dropped to my knees and crawled into the back corner of the closet, tearing away the loose floorboard where I kept my most precious possessions. My hands shook so violently, I scraped my knuckles against the rough wood, but I did not feel the pain. I reached into the dark cavity, expecting to feel the familiar cold metal of my lockbox. My fingers grasped empty air. I searched frantically, digging my hands deeper into the dusty space. Nothing. The heavy metal lockbox was gone. Inside that box was my birth certificate, a few $100s in emergency cash, and the most important thing I owned. My childhood journal from the Colorado Orphanage. The journal containing Leo and his scar, the secret code we created, and the exact dates we were together. The only tangible proof I had to show Richard Montgomery. The only map to finding his lost heir and my long-lost protector. A sharp scent suddenly caught my attention, cutting through the stale air of the apartment. It was a heavy, cloying perfume. Notes of expensive rose and synthetic musk. My stomach dropped. I knew that scent. I had smelled it just last night at the rehearsal dinner when a glass of red wine was thrown into my face. It was Vanessa custom-blended perfume. Before my mind could fully process the implication, my phone vibrated in my pocket. I pulled it out and saw a text message from an unknown number, but the tone was unmistakably hers. "Looking for something, little orphan? I suggest you stop digging through your trash and look out your window." I scrambled to my feet and rushed to the bedroom window, pushing aside the cheap blinds. Down on the street, parked illegally next to a fire hydrant, was a sleek silver sports car. I recognized it immediately. It belonged to Preston, a wealthy trust fund heir Vanessa had been dating for the past 3 months. The passenger side window rolled down slowly. Vanessa leaned out, resting her perfectly manicured hand on the doorframe. She was wearing designer sunglasses, but I could see the malicious smirk twisting her lips. She held up a small worn leather book. My journal. She waved it in the air like a prized trophy before tossing it onto the dashboard out of sight. I turned and sprinted out of the apartment, flying down the concrete stairs of my building. I did not wait for the elevator. I practically leaped down the final flight, bursting through the front lobby doors into the blinding Los Angeles sun. I ran toward the silver sports car, but Preston slammed his foot on the gas. The engine roared and the tires screeched against the asphalt. They sped away down the block, leaving a cloud of exhaust fumes in their wake. I stood on the sidewalk, breathing heavily, my fists clenched at my sides. How did she know? How could she possibly know about the journal and the reward? I pulled out my phone and dialed her number. I knew she would answer. She could never resist an opportunity to gloat. She picked up on the second ring. Her sharp laughter filled my ear. You really should invest in better locks, Haley. That deadbolt was pathetic. It took Preston Driver less than 2 minutes to pry it open. Give it back, Vanessa, I demanded, my voice cold and hard. You have no idea what you are dealing with. That book means nothing to you. Oh, I think it means about $5 million, she replied, her tone dripping with arrogant satisfaction. You see, my sweet, pathetic sister, I had a very interesting morning. Preston took me to view a luxury condo in the Montgomery Tower. We were walking past the private penthouse suites when I heard a commotion in the hallway. I heard a desperate old man offering a massive fortune for information about his lost grandson. And imagine my surprise when I peeked around the corner and saw you standing there in a filthy maid uniform. I gripped the phone tighter. She had followed a rich boyfriend to the building and eavesdropped on my conversation with Richard Montgomery. You are a terrible whisperer, Haley, she continued mockingly. I heard everything. I heard about the Colorado orphanage. I heard about the boy named Leo. And most importantly, I heard you foolishly announce exactly where you kept the proof. A little journal safely locked away in your apartment. You practically handed me the treasure map on a silver platter. You cannot use that journal, I said, trying to keep the rising panic out of my voice. It is my handwriting. It is my memories. Richard Montgomery will know you are lying. Vanessa laughed again, a harsh grating sound. Please, Haley. You think a desperate, grieving old man is going to care about handwriting analysis? He wants hope. I am going to give him hope. I read through your little diary on the way over here. It is full of tragic sob stories and pathetic details. It will be incredibly easy to memorize. I am going to walk right into Richard Montgomery's office and tell him that I am the little girl from the orphanage. I will tell him I was the one who protected his precious Leo. I will be the hero who brings him the clues he needs. You are delusional, I shot back. Thomas and Barbara adopted me. My name is on the legal paperwork from that orphanage, not yours. The dates will not match. You are 2 years older than me. It will take Richard's security team 5 minutes to expose you as a fraud. That is where you are wrong, little orphan, Vanessa said, her voice dripping with venom. You forget who our father is. Thomas knows every legal loophole in the system. He has friends in the county records office. Do you really think he will not forge a few documents for a $5 million payout? Mom and Dad are already on board. They completely agree that this money belongs to the family. You owe us for taking you in. Consider this journal your final payment for all the food and shelter we wasted on you. A fresh wave of anger washed over me, completely eclipsing the shock. They were orchestrating a massive fraud. They were going to exploit a broken billionaire grief just to fund their lavish lifestyle, and they were using my traumatic childhood memories to do it. You will go to prison for this, Vanessa. All of you. Extorting a billionaire is a felony. Richard Montgomery is not some naive fool you can manipulate. He built an empire. He will crush you when he finds out the truth. He will not find out, Vanessa sneered, because you are going to keep your mouth shut. If you try to warn him, if you even try to step foot near that penthouse again, Dad will destroy you. You think taking your business reserve funds was bad. You have no idea what he is capable of. He has financial files with your forged signature on them, Haley. Files that show you embezzling money from your own clients. If you interfere with my $5 million reward, you will spend the next 10 years in a federal penitentiary. The line went dead. I lowered the phone, my hands shaking with a mixture of rage and disbelief. They had planned this with terrifying speed. In the span of a few hours, my adoptive family had transitioned from stealing my company payroll to executing a multi-million-dollar extortion plot. They had weaponized my past and held my future hostage. Vanessa had my journal. She had the names, the dates, the secret code, and the description of the scar. She had everything she needed to walk into Richard Montgomery life and play the role of the tragic orphanage survivor. I turned around and walked back into my ruined apartment. I stepped over the shredded sofa cushions and the scattered papers. I walked into the bathroom and stared at myself in the mirror. My dress was still stained with the red wine Vanessa had thrown in my face the night before. My eyes were dark with exhaustion. My business was bankrupt. My home was destroyed. My only proof of Leo's existence was stolen. I had absolutely nothing left. But as I stared at my reflection, the fear began to recede, leaving behind a cold, calculated focus. Vanessa thought she had won because she held a physical book. She thought she could simply memorize my pain and pass it off as her own. She severely underestimated me. She did not know the emotion behind those words. She did not know the tone of Leo's voice or the exact shape of his scar. She only had ink on paper. I had the actual memories burned into my soul. Thomas thought his forged financial documents would keep me paralyzed with fear. He expected me to cower in the corner and let them execute their massive fraud. He expected the scared 8-year-old girl to obey her master. They were all about to learn a very brutal lesson. I walked to the kitchen sink and washed the dried blood from my cheek where Barbara had slapped me. I stripped off the wine-stained dress and threw it directly into the trash can. I put on a pair of dark jeans and a simple black sweater. I tied my hair back, pulling it tight against my scalp. I was not going to cry. I was not going to beg. I was going to fight. Vanessa wanted to play a dangerous game with a billionaire grief. She wanted to steal my past and sell it for $5 million. I was going to let her walk right into the lion den. I was going to let her build her house of cards as high as she possibly could. And then I was going to burn it to the ground. I grabbed my car keys and walked out of the apartment, leaving the splintered door wide open behind me. I did not need this place anymore. I had a war to win. I drove straight back to the Montgomery Tower. The logical part of my brain screamed that I was walking into a trap, but the fierce protective instinct I harbored for Leo pushed my foot down on the gas pedal. I had to warn Richard before Vanessa could sink her poisonous claws into his desperate heart. I parked my beat-up sedan 3 blocks away and ran toward the towering glass and steel building. The Los Angeles midday heat beat down on my shoulders, but I felt nothing but ice-cold determination. I pushed through the revolving glass doors of the lobby and marched straight toward the private concierge desk. "I need to speak with Mr. Montgomery immediately," I told the head of security. "It is an absolute emergency regarding his grandson." The security chief, a broad-shouldered man named Davis, who had waved me through the service entrance just hours ago, looked at me with cold, flat eyes. He did not reach for his phone. He did not check his guest log. He simply crossed his arms over his chest. "Your clearance has been permanently revoked, Haley. Mr. Montgomery left strict orders that you are not to be allowed past the lobby. If you refuse to leave, I will have you arrested for trespassing." My heart slammed against my ribs. Revoked? How could it be revoked? I just spoke to him this morning. He offered me $1 million. He knows I have information about Leo. Davis stepped out from behind the mahogany desk, his posture threatening. "Mr. Montgomery found the actual girl from the Colorado orphanage, the one who actually wrote the journal. He knows you are just a disgruntled cleaning woman who tried to extort him with a fabricated story. Now leave the premises before I call the police." The absolute audacity of the lie knocked the breath right out of my lungs. Vanessa had not just stolen my journal, she had completely stolen my identity and weaponized it against me before I could even defend myself. She had painted me as the villain in my own life story. I backed away from the desk, my mind racing. If I caused a scene and got arrested, Thomas would use it to destroy what little credibility I had left. I had to play this smart. I turned and walked out of the building, but I did not leave the area. I crossed the street and slipped into a crowded coffee shop with a direct view of the Montgomery Tower private valet entrance. I bought a black coffee with the last $5 bill in my pocket and sat by the window waiting. I did not have to wait long. Less than an hour later, a sleek black Maybach pulled up to the curb. It was Richard's private car. The driver rushed to open the rear door and out stepped Vanessa. She was not wearing her usual revealing designer clothes. Instead, she wore a modest pastel blue dress, her hair styled in soft, innocent waves. She had completely scrubbed away her arrogant socialite persona and replaced it with the image of a humble, sweet girl. She clutched my weathered leather journal tightly against her chest, like it was her most prized possession. My blood boiled as I watched Richard Montgomery step out of the car after her. The powerful billionaire looked completely transformed. The desperate, frantic energy I had seen in his eyes that morning was gone, replaced by a profound, overwhelming gratitude. He placed a gentle paternal hand on Vanessa's back, guiding her toward the private entrance with absolute reverence. She looked up at him, flashing a timid, vulnerable smile that I knew she had practiced in the mirror 1,000 times. She was playing him perfectly. I pulled out my phone and immediately opened a new browser tab, navigating to Vanessa's social media accounts. She had always been addicted to flaunting her lifestyle, and I knew she would not be able to resist boasting about this massive conquest. Sure enough, her profile was already flooded with updates. She had posted a video just 20 minutes ago from the backseat of the Maybach. "Life takes the most unexpected turns," she said to the camera, squeezing out a single perfect crocodile tear. "Today I was reunited with someone connected to a very dark, painful part of my childhood in a Colorado orphanage. I am so blessed to finally be able to use my painful past to bring hope to a grieving family. Please pray for us as we embark on this journey to find a lost loved one." The comments beneath the video were filled with praise and sympathy from her wealthy friends. She had successfully framed herself as the ultimate savior. But the next post was what truly made my stomach turn. It was a photo of her sitting in Richard's private dining room, a spread of gourmet food before her. The caption read, "When a billionaire realizes you are the key to finding his missing grandson, he treats you like royalty. Unlimited resources unlocked. Let the search begin." Unlimited resources. The words echoed in my mind. Richard was blinded by grief and hope. He was a brilliant businessman, but when it came to his lost grandson, he was an open wound, and Vanessa had just poured salt directly into it. She had handed him my journal and spun a web of lies so thick he could not see the truth staring him right in the face. She knew the secret code because she had read it. She knew about the scar above Leo's left eye because I had written it down. She had stolen my trauma and cashed it in for VIP access to a billionaire empire. I needed to talk to Richard directly. I needed to bypass the security wall Vanessa had just built around him. I remembered seeing a direct office line printed on a piece of stationery while I was dusting his study earlier that day. I pulled out my phone, dialing the number from memory and praying he would pick up instead of an assistant. The line rang 3 times before a voice answered. "Montgomery." "Mr. Montgomery." "It is Haley," I said, speaking rapidly before he could hang up. "You have to listen to me. The woman you are with is my adoptive sister. She stole my journal from my apartment this morning. She is lying to you. She was never in that orphanage." There was a heavy silence on the other end of the line. Then I heard a soft, manipulative sigh in the background. It was Vanessa. She was right there in the room with him. "Haley," Richard said, his voice cold and devoid of the warmth he had shown me earlier. "Vanessa warned me you might call. She told me how you found her old journal while cleaning her room at your parents' house. She told me how you read it and tried to use her painful memories to extort money from me before she could come forward with the truth." "That is a complete lie," I practically shouted into the phone. "Mr. Montgomery, ask her about the day we left the orphanage. Ask her about the song Leo used to sing when I was scared. It is not in the journal. Only the real girl from the orphanage would know that." "Enough." Richard snapped, his tone echoing his reputation as a ruthless tycoon. "I will not have you harass this brave young woman any further. She has already suffered enough in that terrible place, and she has suffered enough dealing with your deeply disturbed jealousy. She has graciously asked me not to press extortion charges against you out of respect for your adoptive parents. I strongly suggest you disappear, Haley. If you ever contact me or approach Vanessa again, my legal team will ensure you spend a very long time behind bars." The line went dead. I stared at the phone, my chest heaving with silent, frustrated breaths. Vanessa had anticipated my every move. She had inoculated Richard against the truth by predicting I would claim the journal was stolen. She had weaponized his protective instincts, turning him into her personal shield. He was completely under her spell. Over the next 48 hours, I watched helplessly from the sidelines as Vanessa systematically drained Richard's resources. She posted photos of herself shopping on Rodeo Drive carrying bags from designer boutiques. The caption casually mentioned her new unlimited black card, provided by her generous benefactor, to assist in her search efforts. She moved out of her parents' house and into a luxury guest suite at the Montgomery estate. She was living the life of a billionaire heiress, completely subsidized by a grieving grandfather. And it was not just Vanessa who benefited. Barbara and Thomas were suddenly elevated in Los Angeles high society. Vanessa posted pictures of our adoptive parents dining with Richard Montgomery at private clubs. She captioned the photos, "The wonderful family who saved me from the orphanage meeting the man whose family I am trying to save." The hypocrisy was nauseating. The very people who had treated me like a worthless servant were now being celebrated as generous philanthropists by the man whose grandson I had actually protected. They were living out their ultimate fantasy of wealth and status, all built on the foundation of my stolen identity. They had the money, they had the power, and they had Richard's complete trust. They believed they had utterly defeated me. They believed the scared little girl they had abused for 25 years would simply crawl into a hole and accept her defeat. They forgot one crucial detail. Vanessa only had the journal. She only had the past. She had absolutely no idea how to actually find Leo in the present. She was milking Richard for his money, but eventually she would have to produce results. She would have to find a missing heir she knew absolutely nothing about. I walked out of the coffee shop, tossing my empty cup into the trash bin on the corner. I did not have a black card. I did not have a billionaire protection. I did not even have a home to return to. But I had my memories. I had the real truth locked inside my mind. And I had a fierce, burning determination to find Leo before my toxic adoptive family could destroy his life the same way they had tried to destroy mine. I was going to hunt down the true heir of the Montgomery Empire, and when I brought him back, the collision between the truth and their lies would be biblical. I drove my battered sedan away from the Montgomery Tower and headed straight for the affluent hills of Bel Air. My knuckles were white against the steering wheel. Vanessa thought she had checkmated me by hiding behind Richard Montgomery and his security team, but she still had to report back to the masterminds of this entire operation, Thomas and Barbara. I knew exactly where to find them. I was going to storm into their pristine mansion and tear their extortion plot to shreds. I was going to look Thomas in the eye and demand he return my journal before I marched straight to the police to report the break-in. The wrought iron gates of my adoptive parents' estate loomed ahead. For years, those gates had felt like the bars of a golden cage, keeping me trapped in a cycle of endless gratitude and servitude. Today, they were just an obstacle. The gate was standing wide open, likely left that way by a catering crew setting up for whatever lavish celebration my parents were hosting to toast their newfound proximity to a billionaire. I parked my car recklessly on the manicured gravel driveway and marched right up to the massive double oak doors. I did not bother to knock. I pushed the heavy handles and stepped into the grand marble foyer. The sound of clinking crystal and arrogant laughter echoed from the formal living room. I walked straight toward it, my footsteps heavy and deliberate. When I rounded the corner, the laughter stopped abruptly. Vanessa was lounging on a velvet chaise, sipping an expensive mimosa. She was still wearing the modest blue dress she had used to manipulate Richard earlier. Barbara was examining a catalog of luxury yachts while Thomas stood by the wet bar pouring a glass of scotch. They looked like the perfect picture of aristocratic success. "What are you doing in my house?" Barbara shrieked, dropping her catalog onto the glass coffee table. "How did you get past the gate?" "I am here to end this right now," I said, my voice ringing with a fierce clarity I did not know I possessed. "Vanessa, you are going to hand over my journal. Then the three of you are going to call Richard Montgomery and confess to this massive fraud. If you do not, I am going straight to the police. I will report the break-in at my apartment. I will report the theft. I will report the conspiracy to extort $5 million from a grieving man." Vanessa rolled her eyes, taking a slow, deliberate sip of her drink. "Oh, Haley, you really are exhausting. Do you honestly think the police will care about a stolen diary? It is your word against mine. And right now, I have the backing of the most powerful billionaire in Los Angeles. Who do you think the police will believe? The beloved tragic orphan girl living in a penthouse, or the unhinged cleaning woman who just got fired for being a stalker? You did not just steal a diary, I shot back, taking a step closer to her. You stole my identity. You broke into my home. Thomas, you are an accessory to burglary and extortion. You are risking decades in federal prison for a payout you do not even have yet. You are not invincible. Thomas took a slow sip of his scotch. He did not look angry. He did not look panicked. He looked utterly bored. He set his crystal glass down on the marble bar top with a soft clink and turned to face me. The cold calculation in his eyes made my stomach twist into a tight knot. He was not reacting like a man who had just been caught in a massive criminal conspiracy. He was reacting like a man who had already won the chess match before I even realized we were playing. You have always been too emotional, Haley Thomas said, smoothing the lapels of his tailored suit. It clouds your judgment. It makes you blind to the reality of how the world actually works. You burst in here making threats about police and federal prison, but you have fundamentally misunderstood your position on the board. You are not a player in this game. You are a pawn. I stood my ground, refusing to let his psychological warfare break me. I am not a pawn anymore, Thomas. I am the only one who knows the actual truth. I will burn your entire lives to the ground before I let you exploit Richard Montgomery using my childhood trauma. I am going to the police right now. I turned on my heel, preparing to march out the door and drive straight to the precinct. I highly recommend you stay exactly where you are, Thomas said, his voice dropping to a dangerously quiet register. Unless, of course, you want to spend the next 20 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. I froze, my hand hovering over the brass doorknob. The sheer confidence in his threat forced me to turn back around. Barbara was smiling, a wicked, satisfied smile. Vanessa had pulled out her phone and was casually scrolling through her social media feed, completely unbothered by the interaction. Thomas walked over to a heavy mahogany credenza in the corner of the room. He unlocked the top drawer and pulled out a thick leather-bound folder. He walked slowly back to the coffee table and tossed the folder onto the glass surface. The heavy thud echoed in the tense silence of the room. "Go ahead," Thomas offered, gesturing casually to the leather folder. "Open it. See for yourself why you will not be speaking to Richard Montgomery, the police, or anyone else about this little family arrangement." My hands trembled slightly as I approached the table. I picked up the heavy folder and flipped it open. Inside was a stack of dense financial documents, bank statements, tax filings, and corporate ledgers. The logo at the top of every page belonged to my company, Elite Estate Care. I scanned the first few lines, and my blood instantly turned to ice in my veins. These were not my real financial records. These were highly sophisticated, completely fabricated ledgers. The documents detailed dozens of offshore bank accounts registered in my name in the Cayman Islands and the Bahamas. They showed a systematic pattern of massive embezzlement. According to these papers, I had been severely overcharging my wealthy clients for the past 5 years and funneling hundreds of thousands of dollars into hidden shell companies to avoid paying federal taxes. The paper trail was incredibly dense, backed up by fake invoices, dummy corporation filings, and forged client signatures. "What is this?" I gasped, dropping the folder back onto the table as if it had burned my fingers. "None of this is real. I never opened any offshore accounts. I never overcharged a single client. Every penny I made was clean and fully taxed." "Of course it is not real," Thomas chuckled, walking back to the bar to refill his drink. "But the federal government does not know that. The IRS does not know that. You see, Haley, when I generously offered to be the financial guarantor for your little cleaning business 5 years ago, I did not just sign a piece of paper. I embedded my own private accountants into your corporate structure. I had them create this shadow ledger simultaneously alongside your real books. I have been building this trap for 5 years just in case you ever decided to bite the hand that fed you." The sheer scale of his betrayal hit me with the force of a freight train. He had not just stolen my reserve funds yesterday. He had been actively plotting my absolute destruction from the very first day I tried to build my independence. He had weaponized his parental authority to gain access to my corporate identity, framing me for federal crimes I did not even know existed. You forged my signature, I whispered, staring at the horrific documents. You fabricated a massive federal crime. I protected my investments, Thomas corrected coldly. You were an investment, Haley. We poured money into feeding you, clothing you, and giving you a respectable life. You owed us a return on that investment. Vanessa securing this $5 million reward from Richard Montgomery is that return. You are going to step aside and let her collect it. You are going to forget you ever saw that painting. You are going to forget the name Leo. And if I refuse, I challenged, my voice shaking with a mixture of terror and absolute disgust. If I walk out of here and tell the truth anyway. Thomas stepped right up to me, his face inches from mine. If you speak one single syllable to Richard Montgomery, or the police about Vanessa, or the Journal, I will personally hand-deliver this entire folder to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I will report you for massive tax evasion, wire fraud, and corporate embezzlement. The paper trail is flawless, Haley. My accountants made sure of it. The authorities will seize every asset you have left. They will arrest you. You will be indicted, tried, and convicted before the end of the year. You will lose your business, your reputation, and your freedom. You will rot in a federal prison cell for the next 2 decades. I stared into the cold, dead eyes of the man I had called father for 25 years. There was no bluffing in his gaze. He meant every single word. He was entirely willing to destroy my life, send me to a brutal prison, and frame me for massive felonies just to secure a payout from a grieving billionaire. The cruelty was so absolute, so entirely lacking in basic human empathy, that it took my breath away. Barbara walked up beside him, crossing her arms over her chest. You really brought this on yourself, Haley. If you had just been a grateful daughter, none of this would be necessary. Now you have a very simple choice. You can keep your mouth shut, disappear quietly, and stay out of prison. Or you can try to be a hero and spend the rest of your life in a concrete box. I suggest you take the hint and walk away. Vanessa stood up from the chaise lounge, smoothing down the skirt of her pastel blue dress. She walked over and picked up the leather folder, tapping it lightly against my chest. Checkmate, little orphan, she whispered, a wicked smile dancing on her lips. I told you that you were out of your league. Now run along. We have a $5 million gala to plan, and you are not on the guest list. Thomas snapped his fingers, and 2 massive private security guards stepped out from the hallway shadows. They had clearly been waiting just out of sight. Escort our former daughter off the property, Thomas ordered, turning his back on me to look out the large bay windows. If she ever sets foot near these gates again, call the police and have her arrested for trespassing. The 2 security guards grabbed my arms with bruising force. They did not give me a chance to speak or resist. They dragged me backward across the marble foyer, my heels scraping against the polished stone. They hauled me through the heavy double doors and shoved me roughly down the front steps. I stumbled and fell hard, scraping my hands against the rough gravel of the driveway. The heavy oak doors slammed shut behind me, locking with a heavy metallic thud that echoed in the quiet air of the affluent neighborhood. I sat on the gravel, the Los Angeles sun beating down on my back. My palms were bleeding, my dress was dirty, and my heart was racing a million miles an hour. They had completely cornered me. Thomas had built a flawless legal cage around my life. If I tried to expose Vanessa's fake identity, I would be instantly destroyed by the FBI. I could not go to the police. I could not go to Richard Montgomery. I could not even defend my own company. I was entirely trapped by their blackmail. I slowly pushed myself up from the gravel, dusting off my knees. I looked back at the sprawling mansion. They were inside, probably toasting their brilliant victory right now. They thought they had neutralized the only threat to their $5 million extortion plot. They thought the threat of federal prison would force me into permanent silence and submission. But as I walked back to my battered sedan, a new realization began to crystallize in my mind, cutting through the panic and the fear. Thomas had outsmarted me legally. Vanessa had stolen my past. Barbara had stripped away my dignity. They had taken everything they could possibly take. But they were still missing the one thing that actually mattered. They did not have Leo. Vanessa could parade around the Montgomery penthouse pretending to be me all she wanted. She could memorize the journal and feed Richard comforting lies about the orphanage. But eventually, Richard Montgomery was going to demand results. He was paying $5 million to find his flesh and blood grandson. Vanessa could not produce a person she knew absolutely nothing about. She did not know his mannerisms, his voice, or the deep shared history we had built in the shadows of that orphanage. She was living on borrowed time. If I went to Richard now without proof, I would be thrown in prison. But if I found the real Leo first, if I brought the actual living, breathing heir of the Montgomery Empire directly to his grandfather's door, then Thomas' forged financial documents would mean absolutely nothing. Richard Montgomery had the money and the power to crush Thomas and his accountants in a heartbeat. The only way to break the blackmail was to win the ultimate prize. I opened the car door and slid into the driver's seat, my hands gripping the steering wheel. I was not going to cower in fear of Thomas and his fake ledger. I was going to use the one weapon they could not forge: my true memories. I knew the distinct shape of the scar on Leo's brow. I knew the secret code we used to scratch into the walls. I was going to hunt down the boy who had protected me when we had nothing, and I was going to bring him home. The real search had just begun. The drive back to my small office in downtown Los Angeles felt like navigating through a thick, disorienting fog. I had a clear target now: find Leo. But my adoptive family was not going to simply sit back and let me search in peace. They knew I was a fighter, and they intended to crush my spirit before I could even take the first step. The moment I pushed through the glass doors of Elite Estate Care, the sheer magnitude of their retaliation hit me like a physical blow. The small reception area was absolute chaos. The phones were ringing incessantly, creating a harsh mechanical symphony of panic. My operations manager David was standing behind the reception desk, his face pale and slick with sweat. He was frantically typing on his keyboard while holding a desk phone to his ear. "Haley," he gasped, dropping the receiver the second he saw me. "What is going on? What did you do?" I walked behind the desk, my heart sinking into my stomach. "What do you mean, David? Who is calling?" "Everyone," he said, his voice rising in sheer panic. "Literally everyone. The Harrison estate just canceled their annual contract. The Sinclair family pulled their account 10 minutes ago. And the property management group for the Wilshire Towers just sent a termination email effective immediately. Haley, that is 60% of our monthly revenue gone in less than an hour." I grabbed the computer mouse and refreshed the master inbox. A wave of bold red, unread emails flooded the screen. Cancellation, termination of services, immediate breach of contract. I clicked on the email from the Wilshire Property Group. The message was cold and corporate, but the underlying threat was unmistakable. "We have been informed by the Montgomery Real Estate Holdings Group that Elite Estate Care is currently under federal investigation for financial misconduct. As a vendor associated with the Montgomery portfolio, we cannot maintain ties with your agency." My blood ran cold. Vanessa. She had not wasted a single second. She was sitting in the Montgomery guest suite using Richard's immense corporate influence to systematically slaughter my client list. She was leveraging the billionaire name to blacklist my company across the entire city of Los Angeles. Any wealthy family or property management group that wanted to do business with Richard Montgomery was being forced to sever ties with me immediately. It was a flawless corporate assassination. David grabbed his jacket from the coat rack, his hands shaking. "I am sorry, Haley. I cannot go down with this ship. I have a mortgage. I have kids. The rumor is that the federal authorities are coming to raid this office by the end of the day. I quit." He did not wait for my response. He bolted out the glass doors, leaving me standing alone in the echoing office. The phones continued to ring, but I did not answer them. There was no point. My business, the empire I had built with my bare hands over 5 grueling years, was dead. Vanessa had suffocated it using the very power she had stolen from my past. I sank into the chair behind the reception desk, burying my face in my hands. I needed to think. I needed to figure out how to fund my search for Leo without my company revenue. But my phone buzzed in my pocket, violently breaking my concentration. It was a text message from a local vendor who supplied my cleaning chemicals. The message contained a single link to a social media platform and a brief note. "Have you seen this? You need to get a lawyer right now." I clicked the link. The screen transitioned to a live video broadcast that had been posted 30 minutes ago. It already had tens of thousands of views. The video featured Barbara sitting in her pristine Bel Air living room. She was wearing a conservative beige blouse and minimal makeup, looking like the perfect embodiment of a heartbroken, distressed mother. "It is with a completely shattered heart that I make this video," Barbara said to the camera, her voice trembling with manufactured grief. "For 25 years, my husband and I poured our souls into raising our adopted daughter, Haley. We gave her a beautiful home, the best education, and endless unconditional love. But today, I have to share a tragedy that has torn our family apart." I stared at the screen, my stomach churning with absolute disgust. She was putting on an award-winning performance. She paused, wiping a fake tear from her eye with a tissue. "Haley has recently suffered a severe psychotic break." Barbara continued, looking directly into the camera lens. "She has become deeply delusional and dangerously paranoid. She is currently undergoing a massive mental health crisis. Over the past few days, she has attempted to extort our family for millions of dollars, using completely fabricated stories about her childhood. She has even stalked my biological daughter, Vanessa, and harassed a grieving family in our community. We are working with medical professionals to get Haley involuntarily committed to a psychiatric facility before she hurts herself or someone else. Please, if you know her or do business with her, be warned. She is not in her right mind. She is a pathological liar and a danger to society." I dropped the phone onto the desk as if the device itself had turned toxic. Barbara had just deployed the most devastating weapon in a manipulator arsenal: the public smear campaign. She had preemptively destroyed my credibility in the court of public opinion. If I went to the police now, they would see Barbara video and assume I was exactly what she claimed: a delusional, bitter adopted daughter having a mental breakdown. If I went to the press with the truth, they would point to Barbara's tearful broadcast and label me a desperate extortionist. My phone began to explode with notifications. The comments section under Barbara video was a vicious feeding frenzy. People I had known for years, clients, acquaintances, even old high school classmates, were tearing me apart. Words like ungrateful psychopath and dangerous filled my screen. They were calling for my arrest. They were demanding my business be shut down. In the span of 30 minutes, Barbara had completely obliterated my personal reputation. I was no longer a respected business owner. I was a public pariah. The glass doors of my office suddenly swung open. I jumped up, expecting it to be another angry client, or perhaps the police. Instead, it was my landlord, Mr. Henderson. He was an older man who had always been kind to me, but today his face was set in hard, unforgiving lines. He held a manila folder in his hand. "Haley, I need you to vacate the premises immediately," Mr. Henderson said, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. "Mr. Henderson, my lease is paid through the end of the month," I argued, trying to keep the panic out of my voice. "You cannot just kick me out." "Your business accounts were frozen by the bank an hour ago, Haley. Your rent check bounced." He tossed the manila folder onto the reception desk. "And frankly, I saw the video your mother posted online. I have other tenants in this building. I cannot have a mentally unstable extortionist operating out of my property. It is a massive liability. You have exactly 1 hour to gather your personal belongings and leave. If you are not gone, I will have the authorities remove you for trespassing." He turned and walked out, leaving the eviction notice sitting next to my ringing phones. The walls of the office felt like they were closing in on me. Thomas had not bluffed. He had actually frozen my corporate accounts, using his embedded accountants, cutting off my access to every single penny I had earned. Vanessa had destroyed my client list. Barbara had destroyed my reputation. And now I was losing my physical workspace. They were systematically stripping away every resource I had, leaving me completely naked and defenseless in the world. I had 1 hour. I did not waste it crying. I grabbed a cardboard box from the supply closet and began packing only the absolute essentials. I took my laptop, my external hard drives containing all my client contact information, and a few changes of clothes I kept in the office for long shifts. I left the expensive cleaning equipment, the custom printed uniforms, and the heavy filing cabinets. I could not carry them, and I had nowhere to store them. I carried the heavy cardboard box out to my battered sedan parked in the alley behind the building. I shoved the box into the back seat and slammed the door shut. I climbed into the driver's seat, locking the doors and gripping the steering wheel. I was breathing heavily, the reality of my situation crashing down on me with suffocating weight. I was 33 years old. I had $0 in my bank account. I had no business, no reputation, and nowhere to go. I was officially homeless. My phone buzzed again. This time it was an email notification from my apartment complex management. It was a formal eviction notice identical to the one Mr. Henderson had just handed me. My personal accounts had been linked to my business accounts. Thomas had frozen everything. I could not even return to my ruined apartment to sleep. I turned the key in the ignition. The old engines sputtered before roaring to life. I drove away from downtown Los Angeles, navigating aimlessly through the heavy afternoon traffic. As the sun began to set, casting long dark shadows across the city streets, I pulled into the empty parking lot of a 24-hour diner on the outskirts of town. I parked under a flickering street lamp, offering a small measure of safety in the desolate area. I reclined the driver's seat, staring up at the stained fabric of the car roof. The ambient light from the diner cast strange, moving shadows across the dashboard. This was my new reality. A battered sedan was my bedroom, my office, and my only sanctuary. My adoptive family expected me to break right here in this parking lot. They expected me to surrender to the crushing weight of poverty and public humiliation. They expected the scared orphan to finally accept her defeat and crawl away into the darkness forever. I sat up, pulling my laptop from the cardboard box in the back seat. I cracked the window slightly, letting the cool night air into the stuffy car. I turned on the laptop, the bright screen illuminating my determined face in the dark vehicle. I connected to the diner-free wireless internet network. They took my money. They took my reputation. They took my home. But they made one fatal miscalculation. They backed a survivor into a corner and left her with absolutely nothing to lose. I opened a secure browser window. I did not have a $5 million budget, but I had fierce, unyielding desperation. I began typing search queries into the database, looking for state archival records in Colorado. I was going to find Leo. I was going to rip the Montgomery Empire right out of Vanessa manicured hands. I was going to drag the real heir back to Los Angeles and drop him right on Richard Montgomery doorstep. The hunt had officially begun, and I would not stop until my adoptive family was completely and utterly destroyed. The diner was nearly empty, filled only with the hum of the refrigerator and the faint smell of old coffee. I stared at my laptop screen, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. State archival records in Colorado. It was a needle in a haystack, and I was looking for it in the dark. But I had one advantage Vanessa didn't have. I knew what to look for. I began my search cross-referencing orphanage closures, state ward transfers, and foster care placements from 25 years ago. The records were dense, often digitized poorly, and full of redactions. I spent hours sifting through pages of bureaucratic jargon, my eyes burning from the screen's glare. I needed to find the specific transfer that moved Leo away from the Colorado orphanage. I knew he hadn't stayed there long after I was adopted. The memory of his desperate run behind Thomas's car was burned into my mind. He wouldn't have stayed somewhere that reminded him of my departure. He would have run, or he would have been moved. My search yielded a few promising leads: a group home in Denver, a foster placement in Springs, a juvenile detention center in Pueblo. But none of them had a record of a boy named Leo, with a scar above his left eyebrow. The name itself might have been changed, a common occurrence in the system. I needed something more specific, something only Leo and I shared: the secret code. The secret. It was a simple substitution cipher we'd created to communicate without the caretakers knowing. We'd etched it into the boiler room wall, a testament to our bond. If Leo had kept the code, if he'd used it somewhere else, it might be the key. I expanded my search parameters, looking for any mention of unusual symbols or ciphers in juvenile records from that era. It was a long shot, but I was desperate. I combed through incident reports, counselor notes, and behavioral assessments. Hours turned into days. I barely slept, living off cheap diner coffee and sheer willpower. My car became a mobile command center parked in obscure lots with free Wi-Fi. I watched the fuel gauge drop, my meager cash reserves dwindling. Then on the fourth night I found it. It was a scanned page from a counselor's notebook dated 3 years after my adoption. The notes described a troubled 13-year-old boy in a Chicago group home. The boy was described as withdrawn, defiant, and possessing a distinctive scar above his left eyebrow. But what caught my eye was a small, crudely drawn symbol in the margin of the counselor's notes. It was our code, the symbol for protector. My heart hammered against my ribs. It was him. It had to be. The boy's name in the file was listed as Liam, but the details aligned perfectly. He'd been transferred from Colorado to Illinois, bouncing through various placements before ending up in Chicago. I had a location, a new name, and a timeline. But finding a specific Liam in Chicago 20 years later was a daunting task. I needed professional help. I counted my remaining cash. It wasn't much, barely enough for a few weeks of food and gas. But I couldn't do this alone. I needed someone who knew how to navigate the shadows, someone who could track down a ghost. I searched online for private investigators in Los Angeles, looking for someone discreet, affordable, and willing to take on a difficult case. I found a small agency run by a former police detective named Marcus Vance. His website promised confidentiality and results. I called his number, my hands shaking. "Vance Investigations," a gruff voice answered. "Mr. Vance," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I need your help finding someone. A man named Liam, last known to be in Chicago about 20 years ago." "That's a cold trail," Vance said, his tone skeptical. "It'll cost you." "I have $1,000, I offered, knowing it was a paltry sum for a private investigator. "And I have some specific details that might help." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "$1,000 won't get you far," Vance said finally. "But I'll hear you out. Meet me at my office in an hour." Vance's office was located above a strip mall in a less affluent part of the city. The room smelled of stale cigarette smoke and old paper. Vance himself was a burly man with a thick mustache and sharp, calculating eyes. I laid out everything I knew: the orphanage in Colorado, the transfer to Chicago, the new name, Liam, the scar, and the secret code. I showed him the scanned counselor's notes. Vance examined the documents, his expression unreadable. "You're asking me to find a man who's been lost in the system for 2 decades, he said, "with only $1,000. "I know it's not much," I pleaded. "But it's all I have, and I know he's the key to stopping a massive extortion plot involving Richard Montgomery." Vance's eyebrows shot up. "The billionaire." "Yes," I confirmed. "My adoptive family is using a forged journal to convince him they found his grandson. But the boy in the journal is Leo, and I believe Leo is Liam." Vance leaned back in his chair, tapping a pen against his desk. He stared at me for a long moment, assessing my desperation, my determination. "All right," he said finally. "I'll take the case. But I'm not doing it for the $1,000. I'm doing it because I don't like extortionists. And I don't like people who exploit the vulnerable." Relief washed over me, so profound it almost brought me to tears. "Thank you," I whispered. Vance wasted no time. He tapped into databases I didn't even know existed, cross-referencing names, aliases, and known associates. He tracked down former social workers, scoured public records, and analyzed social media profiles. Days bled into a week. I spent my time parked near Vance's office, anxious for updates. My car was becoming a claustrophobic prison, but I couldn't leave. I had to be ready to act the moment he found something. Finally, Vance called me into his office. "I think I found him," he said, handing me a manila folder. I opened it, my hands trembling. Inside was a recent photograph of a man in his early 30s. He was standing in front of an auto repair shop, his hands covered in grease. His dark hair was unruly, his jawline strong, and there just above his left eyebrow was the faint but unmistakable line of a scar. "His name is Liam Hayes now," Vance explained. "He owns a small mechanic shop in a suburb of Chicago. He's been living off the grid, mostly cash businesses, no significant social media presence. But the facial recognition software flagged the scar." I stared at the photograph, tears pricking my eyes. It was Leo, my protector. He looked tired, hardened by life, but the fierce glint in his eyes remained. "Where is the shop?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "It's an address in Cicero," Vance said, tapping the folder. "You're going to Chicago." I looked at my dwindling cash reserves, then at the photograph of Leo. The choice was clear. I said, a new resolve settling in my chest. "I'm going to bring him home." The drive to Chicago was grueling. I pushed my battered sedan to its limits, stopping only for cheap gas and brief naps at rest stops. The landscape blurred past a monotonous stretch of highway that mirrored my singular focus. I had to reach Leo before Vanessa's lies solidified into an unbreakable truth. I had to show Richard Montgomery the real heir, the man who held the key to my redemption and my family's downfall. I arrived in Cicero on a dreary Tuesday morning. The suburb was a grid of industrial parks and modest residential neighborhoods. I navigated the unfamiliar streets, my heart pounding in rhythm with the turn signal. The auto repair shop, Hayes Mechanics, was located in a dilapidated cinder block building on a corner lot. The sign was faded, the parking lot filled with half-dismantled cars. I parked my sedan across the street, watching the shop doors. For a long time, there was no movement. The anticipation was agonizing. What if Vance was wrong? What if this Liam was just a man with a similar scar? Then the bay doors rolled up. A figure emerged, wiping his hands on a greasy rag. It was him. The dark hair, the broad shoulders, the way he carried himself with a quiet, watchful intensity. He looked older, rougher, but the core of the boy I knew was still there. I stepped out of my car, my legs trembling. I crossed the street, the sound of my own footsteps seeming deafening in the quiet morning air. As I approached, he looked up, his eyes narrowing slightly. He didn't recognize me. Why would he? I was no longer the scared 8-year-old girl he'd protected. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice deep and guarded. I stopped a few feet away, my breath catching in my throat. I looked directly into his eyes, searching for a flicker of memory. "The boiler room was cold in the winter," I said softly, the words feeling heavy on my tongue. "But the pipes kept us warm when we hid behind them." He froze. The rag slipped from his hands, landing softly on the concrete. His eyes widened, the guarded expression shattering. "Haley?" He breathed the name, sounding foreign and familiar all at once. "It's me, Leo," I whispered, tears finally spilling over. "I found you." Leo stared at me. The grease on his hands stained the sides of his jeans as he wiped them unconsciously. The harsh morning sunlight caught the faint white line above his left eyebrow. For a long moment, neither of us moved. The noisy street behind me seemed to fade into absolute silence. He stepped forward, his heavy work boots crunching on the gravel. He reached out a hand, stopping just short of touching my shoulder, as if he was afraid I was a mirage that would shatter. "Haley," he repeated, the name sounding rusty on his tongue. "You are really here. How did you find me?" "We need to talk, Leo," I said, glancing nervously up and down the street. I was terrified that Thomas had hired someone to follow me. "Not out here. Do you have an office?" He nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving my face. He gestured toward a rusted metal door adjacent to the open garage bays. I followed him inside. The office was small and smelled intensely of motor oil and stale coffee. A battered desk sat in the center, piled high with invoices and car parts. He pulled up a folding chair for me and leaned against the edge of the desk, crossing his muscular arms. "You look different," he said. "You are not that terrified little girl anymore. And you are not the skinny boy who fought off the older kids," I replied, offering a faint smile. "But you are still hiding. Why did you change your name to Liam?" When I aged out of the foster system, I wanted a clean slate, he explained, his voice guarded. I wanted to disappear from the state records, so nobody could ever force me into another group home. I came to Chicago, started turning wrenches, and kept my head down. Now tell me why you are here, Haley. You did not drive halfway across the country just to catch up on old times. I took a deep breath. I need you to listen to me carefully, Leo. What I am about to tell you is going to sound completely insane, but every single word is the absolute truth. I drove here because your real name is Leo Montgomery. You are the only grandson and sole heir of Richard Montgomery. He is a billionaire real estate tycoon in Los Angeles, and he has been desperately searching for you for 20 years. Leo stared at me, his expression going completely blank. A heavy, suffocating silence filled the cramped office. Then he let out a short, bitter laugh and shook his head. He pushed off the desk and walked over to a small window looking out at the junkyard. "That is a bad joke, Haley," he said, his tone turning instantly cold. "I do not know what kind of scam you are running, but you picked the wrong guy. I change oil and rebuild transmissions for a living. I barely make rent on this shop. I do not have a billionaire grandfather waiting for me in a mansion. My father was a deadbeat who dumped me in the system and vanished." "Your father kidnapped you," I argued, standing up from the folding chair. "Richard Montgomery is your father. Your mother died in an accident when you were very young. Your father blamed Richard, and out of pure spite, he took you away and hid you in the system under a fake name to punish him. Richard has spent tens of millions of dollars trying to find you." Leo turned around, his eyes flashing with sudden, intense anger. "Stop it!" he demanded, pointing a grease-stained finger at me. "Do not come in here after 25 years and try to sell me a fairy tale. I lived through hell in those group homes. I got beaten, starved, and thrown into solitary confinement. Where was this powerful billionaire grandfather then? If he had so much money and power, why did he leave me to rot?" "Because your father hid you perfectly," I pleaded, stepping closer. "He wanted Richard to suffer." But Richard never stopped looking. He is offering a $5 million reward for any information about your whereabouts. The mention of the money caused Leo to recoil, as if I had slapped him. He crossed his arms again, a wall of defensive hostility radiating from him. "So that is what this is about," he sneered. "You tracked me down so you can collect a massive paycheck. You want to drag me back to Los Angeles, parade me in front of some rich old man, and cash in on my existence. I thought you were different, Haley. I thought you were the one person who actually cared about me." His words cut me deeply, but I refused to back down. "I am not taking a single dime from him, Leo. I refuse the money. I am here because my adoptive family is trying to steal that reward. They are using our shared past to execute a massive extortion plot, and they are going to destroy my life in the process." I quickly laid out the entire horrific sequence of events. I told him about Thomas and Barbara stealing my company payroll. I told him about the violent confrontation at the rehearsal dinner. I explained how Vanessa broke into my apartment, stole my childhood journal, and presented herself to Richard Montgomery as the orphan girl who protected his grandson. I told him how Thomas framed me for federal tax evasion and threatened to send me to prison if I exposed their lies. I told him how they systematically destroyed my business, my reputation, and my home in a matter of hours. Leo listened, his jaw clenching tighter with every sentence. The anger in his eyes shifted from me to the people who had abused me. He remembered the terrified little girl I used to be, and the protective instinct he had buried for 2 decades began to surface. But he was still fighting the reality of his own identity. "Even if I believe your story about your twisted adoptive family," he said, pacing the small office, he still struggled with the core truth. "I cannot be this Montgomery heir. It makes no sense. I do not belong in a penthouse. I belong here in the grease and the dirt. You are asking me to walk into a world I know absolutely nothing about, based on a crazy theory and a stolen diary. I cannot do it, Haley. I am not a savior. I am just a mechanic. You need to leave. Go back to Los Angeles and find another way out of your mess." I felt a surge of desperate panic. I could not lose him now. I could not let Thomas and Vanessa win. I looked frantically around the messy office. My eyes landed on a clipboard and a thick black grease pencil sitting on his desk. I grabbed them. "What are you doing?" he asked, stepping forward. I slammed the clipboard onto the desk and pressed the grease pencil against the white paper. "You think I am making this up?" I challenged him, my voice trembling with raw emotion. "You think I am just trying to use you? Look at this." I drew a straight vertical line. Then I drew a circle intersecting the top half of the line. I slashed 2 diagonal lines through the center of the circle. I drew quickly, relying on muscle memory that had been dormant for 25 years. I finished the first symbol and moved to the next, a triangle with a dot in the center, a square with a wavy line beneath it. I drew the entire secret code we had created behind the boiler room, the code we used to warn each other when the abusive caretakers were coming, the code we used to signal where we had hidden extra scraps of food. I dropped the grease pencil. It rolled off the desk and clattered onto the concrete floor. I shoved the clipboard toward him. "Vanessa has my journal," I said, my voice breaking. "She can memorize the names and the dates. She can pretend to be me. But she does not know what this means. She does not know that the first symbol means danger. She does not know that the second symbol means safe hiding spot. She does not know that on the night before I was adopted, you drew the third symbol on my palm with a piece of charcoal. It meant forever protected. You told me that no matter where I went, you would always be my shield." Leo stared at the clipboard. His hands dropped to his sides. The tough, cynical mechanic facade completely melted away, leaving the vulnerable boy I had known in Colorado. He reached out and traced the crude symbols with a trembling finger. He remembered. The undeniable weight of our shared trauma and our unbreakable bond filled the room. "You promised me, Leo," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. "You promised you would protect me. Right now, I am fighting for my life against monsters who want to throw me in a federal prison and steal $5 million from a grieving old man who happens to be your real family. I cannot fight them alone. I need my protector back." Leo looked up from the clipboard. His dark eyes met mine, and the walls he had built around his heart for 25 years finally collapsed. He saw the desperate, terrified 8-year-old girl standing right in front of him. He realized that the world had not protected me, and that my adoptive family had only continued the cycle of abuse we had endured in the orphanage. He picked up a dirty rag and began wiping the grease from his hands with slow, deliberate motions. He looked around his cramped, messy office, and then out the window at the rusted cars in his lot. He was processing the massive paradigm shift of his entire existence. He was a billionaire heir. He had a family that actually wanted him. He tossed the rag onto the desk. He walked over to a metal locker in the corner and pulled out a clean denim jacket. He shrugged it on his broad shoulders, setting into a posture of absolute resolve. The hesitant mechanic was gone. The fierce protector had returned. "What kind of car did you drive here?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. "A battered sedan," I replied, wiping my eyes. "It is parked across the street." "We are not driving that to Los Angeles," he said, grabbing a set of keys from a hook on the wall. "If we are going to war against your adoptive family and taking back my grandfather, we are doing it fast. I have a custom-built muscle car in the back bay. We can make it to California in 2 days if we take turns driving." "You believe me?" I asked, a massive wave of relief washing over my entire body. "You are really coming with me?" Leo walked over and placed his heavy hands on my shoulders, just like he used to do when we were kids. "I do not care about the billions, Haley," he said, looking deep into my eyes. "I do not care about the penthouses or the fancy suits. I am coming because nobody gets to lock you in a cage." Thomas and Vanessa thought they were playing a game with a defenseless orphan. They are about to find out exactly what happens when you wake up a monster. He dropped his hands and moved toward the garage bay doors. "We have a long drive ahead of us. Tell me every single detail about this fake ledger Thomas created. Tell me exactly how Vanessa is manipulating my grandfather. We are going to tear their entire extortion plot apart piece by piece, and we are going to make them beg for mercy." I followed him into the garage, a fierce, triumphant smile spreading across my face. The hunt was over. The real heir was found. Thomas, Barbara, and Vanessa were living on borrowed time, and their absolute destruction was speeding toward them on 4 wheels. Leo and I spent the next 2 days meticulously planning our return to Los Angeles. We packed his custom-built muscle car with essentials, the heavy engine rumbling a promise of the reckoning to come. The drive from Chicago was a blur of strategy sessions and shared memories, the miles melting away as we mapped out our approach. We needed to be smart. We couldn't just walk into the Montgomery Tower and demand an audience. Vanessa had already poisoned that well. We needed undeniable proof, and we needed to present it directly to Richard's legal team, bypassing the security apparatus Vanessa had co-opted. As we crossed the California state line, the air thick with anticipation, my phone vibrated in the cup holder. It was an email from Marcus Vance, the private investigator I had hired. The subject line read, "Urgent, Montgomery situation escalating." I pulled into the next rest stop, the tires crunching on the gravel, and opened the message. My eyes scanned the text, the blood draining from my face. Vance had tapped into his network of informants and uncovered a devastating development. Vanessa hadn't just settled into the luxury of the Montgomery estate. She had accelerated her extortion plot with terrifying audacity. According to Vance's sources, Vanessa had presented Richard Montgomery with a highly sophisticated forged DNA report and a fabricated death certificate. She had woven a tragic tale claiming that she had finally tracked down the boy from her memories, only to discover he had died in a tragic accident years ago. The forged documents were impeccable, designed to withstand preliminary scrutiny. She had effectively killed Leo in the eyes of his grandfather. The cruelty of the lie was suffocating. She hadn't just stolen his identity, she had stolen his right to exist in Richard's world. But the true motive behind the fake death was even more sinister. Vance's email detailed the next phase of the con. Vanessa had convinced Richard that in honor of his lost grandson, the $5 million reward should be donated to a newly established charity, the Leo Montgomery Memorial Fund. She had played the grieving friend perfectly, advocating for the money to be used to help orphans just like them. It was a masterclass in emotional manipulation. The catch. The charity was a hollow shell, a fraudulent entity hurriedly registered in Delaware. And the primary beneficiary, the sole administrator of the fund, was none other than Thomas. My adoptive father was positioning himself to receive the entire $5 million payout directly from Richard's accounts, laundered through a fake charity to avoid suspicion. It was a massive coordinated theft, and they were days away from executing it. I handed the phone to Leo, my hands shaking with a mixture of rage and panic. He read the email, his jaw clenching so tight the muscles jumped. The quiet mechanic from Chicago vanished, replaced entirely by the fierce protector I remembered. He didn't shout. He didn't break anything. He just stared at the screen, a cold, calculating fury settling into his eyes. "They killed me," he said, his voice dangerously soft. "They looked an old man in the eye, a man grieving his daughter, and they killed his only grandson just to steal his money." "It's a forged death certificate, Leo," I said, trying to steady my own breathing. "It's a lie. We're here. We can prove it." "A lie that Thomas is going to cash in for $5 million, Leo countered, handing the phone back to me. "They aren't just greedy, Haley. They're sociopaths. They're exploiting a man's deepest trauma to fund their lifestyle." He turned the key in the ignition, the engine roaring to life with aggressive force. "We need to get to Los Angeles now. We need to stop that transfer." The remaining drive was tense, the silence heavy with the implications of Vance's email. Vanessa had escalated the stakes from simple fraud to massive wire fraud and grand larceny. Thomas was orchestrating a federal crime, and Barbara was likely already spending the anticipated funds. They were drunk on their own arrogance, convinced their fabricated reality was impenetrable. We arrived in Los Angeles late that evening, the city lights a sprawling sea of neon. I directed Leo to a modest motel on the outskirts of the city, a place far removed from the affluent neighborhoods my adoptive family frequented. We needed a safe base of operations, a place where we couldn't be tracked or intimidated. Once we were settled in the cramped room, I called Vance. He answered on the first ring, his tone brisk and professional. "You saw the email," he said. "They're moving fast. Montgomery's legal team is reviewing the charity documentation now." If it passes their compliance checks, the funds could be transferred by the end of the week. We're in LA. I told him the exhaustion of the drive warring with the adrenaline of the situation. And I brought the real Leo. We need to stop the transfer, Vance. We need to expose them. Bringing the real guy changes the game, Vance acknowledged. But we have to be smart. If we just show up at the tower, security will toss you out before you can say a word. Vanessa has them wrapped around her finger. So what do we do? Leo asked, leaning closer to the phone. How do we get to my grandfather? We bypass the emotional blockade and hit the legal wall, Vance explained. Montgomery has a personal attorney, a man named Arthur Sterling. He's been with the family for decades, handles all the personal trusts and private matters. He's ruthless, fiercely protective of the Montgomery assets, and deeply suspicious of anyone asking for money. Sterling is reviewing the charity documents. I asked, a plan forming in my mind. Exactly, Vance confirmed. Sterling is the gatekeeper. He doesn't care about Vanessa's tears or her tragic stories. He cares about liability and legal exposure. If we can prove to him that the death certificate is a forgery and the charity is a shell, he will stop the transfer instantly. I have Leo's real medical records, I said, my voice gaining strength. I have his birth certificate, his employment history, everything that proves he's alive. And I have the recording of Vanessa discussing the trust fund theft. That's a start, Vance agreed. But we need undeniable proof of his identity. We need a DNA test, and we need it conducted by a lab Sterling trusts. I looked at Leo. He nodded, his expression resolute. Whatever it takes, he said. I'll set up a meeting with Sterling, Vance promised. I have some leverage with his firm. I'll get us in the room. But you have to be ready to present an airtight case. If Sterling thinks this is another scam, he'll bury you both. The next 24 hours were a whirlwind of preparation. Vance coordinated a rapid DNA test at a highly reputable private laboratory, the results expedited for an exorbitant fee that depleted the last of my savings. It was a gamble, but a necessary one. While we waited for the results, I finalized the dossier of evidence. I compiled the recording of Vanessa, the forged financial documents Thomas had used to blackmail me, and every shred of proof establishing Leo's true identity. We were building an inescapable legal cage, one that Thomas and Vanessa wouldn't see coming until the bars slammed shut. The DNA results arrived the following afternoon. They were conclusive, a 99.9% match establishing a familial relationship with Richard Montgomery based on samples the billionaire had previously submitted to the national database. We had the proof. We had the heir. Vance called an hour later. I've got the meeting, he announced. Tomorrow morning at Sterling's private office in Century City. He's giving us exactly 15 minutes. That's all we need, I replied, a cold, hard determination settling over me. The night before the meeting, I couldn't sleep. I paced the small motel room, my mind racing through the upcoming confrontation. We were about to expose a massive fraud tear down my adoptive family's carefully constructed illusion and reunite a billionaire with his long-lost grandson. The stakes were astronomical, the potential fallout catastrophic. Leo sat on the edge of the bed watching me pace. He looked calm, centered, the fierce protector ready for battle. Are you okay? He asked, his voice low and steady. I'm terrified, I admitted, stopping by the window. Thomas is a dangerous man. If he finds out what we're doing before we reach Sterling, he'll destroy us. Leo stood up and walked over to me. He placed his heavy hands on my shoulders, just as he had in the orphanage, just as he had in the mechanic shop. He's a coward, hiding behind forged papers and stolen money. Leo said, his dark eyes locked on mine. He doesn't know what it means to fight for survival. We do. We're going to walk into that office tomorrow and we're going to end this, together. I nodded, drawing strength from his unwavering resolve. The scared orphan was gone. In her place stood a woman, armed with the truth, ready to dismantle the toxic family that had tried to bury her. The trap was set, the evidence prepared. Tomorrow the illusion would shatter. While we sat in that cramped motel room preparing to dismantle their entire world, my adoptive family was busy celebrating their perceived absolute victory. Across the city in the sprawling Bel Air mansion, the atmosphere was electric with toxic triumph. Thomas had hired a private catering crew to serve expensive champagne and imported caviar. The grand foyer where I had been violently thrown out just days ago was now filled with the clinking of crystal glasses and the booming, arrogant laughter of people who believed they were untouchable. Vanessa was the center of attention. She paraded around the living room wearing a brand new custom-fitted designer gown that cost more than my first car. Around her neck rested a heavy diamond collar that sparkled brilliantly under the chandelier. She had not paid for it with cash. None of them were using cash. They were riding the massive adrenaline high of the impending $5 million payout. Thomas stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows looking out at the circular driveway. A flatbed truck had just delivered his latest acquisition. It was a brand new midnight black Porsche 911. The dealer had been more than happy to extend an astronomical line of credit when Thomas casually showed him the preliminary transfer documents from the Leo Montgomery Memorial Fund. The documents were technically just proposals, but the billionaire's signature on the foundational paperwork was enough to open any financial door in Los Angeles. Barbara walked up beside him, swirling a glass of vintage champagne. She was dripping in new pearls and wearing a limited edition luxury watch. She leaned her head against his shoulder, admiring the sports car. "It is beautiful, Thomas," she purred, her voice laced with pure greed. "And to think we are getting all of this just for playing a little game of pretend with a grieving old man. The charity fund transfer is going to clear by Friday. I have already contacted a realtor about buying that summer home in Malibu we always wanted." Thomas took a slow, satisfied sip of his drink. He did not look worried about the massive debt they were accumulating. He looked like a man who had successfully conquered the world. "The beauty of the charity structure is that the money comes to us completely tax-free," he explained, a wicked smile twisting his lips. "We are the sole administrators. Richard Montgomery will deposit $5 million into the account to honor his dead grandson, and we will use every single penny to fund our empire. The legal framework is flawless. Even if Richard eventually realizes the charity is a shell, the money will already be washed through our offshore accounts." But their greed was not just focused on luxury items. Their malice toward me was still a burning obsession. They wanted to ensure I was completely annihilated so I could never rise from the ashes to challenge them. Thomas walked over to the mahogany coffee table and picked up a thick stack of legal documents. He flipped through the pages, stopping at a formal foreclosure notice. "I spoke with the property management company that handles Haley Apartment Building," Thomas announced to the room. "The false ledger I created did exactly what it was supposed to do. Her corporate accounts are completely frozen, and the bank has triggered a default protocol on all her personal assets. I also took the liberty of contacting her auto loan provider. Her car will be repossessed by tomorrow morning." Vanessa laughed, a sharp, cruel sound that echoed off the marble walls. She walked over and looked at the eviction notice, her eyes gleaming with vicious delight. "So the little orphan is officially on the streets. I wonder which bridge she is sleeping under tonight." "She will not even have the streets soon," Thomas replied, his voice cold and calculated. "I am expediting the fraud charges using my embedded accountants. Once the federal authorities see the fabricated paper trail, they will issue a warrant for her arrest. She will be locked in a holding cell by the end of the week. We have completely neutralized her. She has no money, no business, and no voice. Even if she tries to scream the truth from a prison cell, nobody will listen to an indicted embezzler." Barbara clapped her hands together, genuinely thrilled by the prospect of my absolute destruction. "It is exactly what she deserves," she declared, taking another sip of champagne. "After everything we did for her. We took her out of the dirt, and she dared to act like she was better than us. She dared to judge our choices. Now she gets to rot in a cell while we live the life we were always meant to have. I always knew she was bad blood. You cannot turn a street rat into a swan." The sheer arrogance of their celebration was rooted in one massive, fatal assumption. They believed their lie was bulletproof because they believed Leo was a ghost who could never return to haunt them. Vanessa strutted over to the bar, pouring herself another glass of expensive champagne. She leaned against the marble counter, basking in the admiration of her parents. The best part about all of this, Vanessa boasted, is how incredibly easy it was to break Richard Montgomery. You should have seen him, Thomas. When I handed him that fake death certificate, he literally fell to his knees and wept. He was completely pathetic. He was shaking and sobbing like a child. She laughed again, waving her hand dismissively. The forged DNA report was a stroke of absolute genius. I told him I hired a private investigator using the black card he gave me. I told him I tracked down the boy from my orphanage memories, only to find out he died in a tragic car accident 5 years ago. I even manufactured a beautiful little story about how Leo always wanted to help other orphans. Richard ate it up like a starving dog. He was so desperate for closure he did not even question the paperwork. He just thanked me for bringing him the truth. Thomas nodded, his expression filled with dark pride. The death certificate was the final nail in the coffin. As long as Richard Montgomery believes his grandson is dead, he will never stop funding our charity to honor his memory. We have effectively buried the truth forever. The boy from Colorado is legally deceased, and the only person who knows his real identity is about to be locked in a federal penitentiary. They raised their glasses in a synchronized toast. To the Montgomery fortune, Barbara cheered. To the Montgomery fortune, Thomas and Vanessa echoed, their voices ringing with absolute certainty. They danced around their living room, surrounded by unpaid luxury goods and stolen wealth, completely oblivious to the massive storm gathering just a few miles away. They thought they had orchestrated the perfect crime. They had weaponized a billionaire trauma, stolen my identity, and fabricated a death to secure their ultimate payout. They believed they were the smartest people in Los Angeles, holding all the cards and pulling all the strings. They did not know that the dead boy was currently sitting in a motel room in the valley, his hands clenched into fists, ready to tear their empire apart. They did not know that the indicted embezzler had secured a private meeting with the most ruthless attorney in the city. They were drunk on their own hubris, blindly celebrating on the deck of a sinking ship. As the night deepened, their party grew louder. Vanessa paraded around, taking photos of her diamond necklace for social media, making sure to tag the luxury boutiques where she had opened massive lines of credit. She posted videos of herself sitting inside the brand new Porsche, blowing kisses to her followers. Thomas made phone calls to offshore bankers, setting up the routing numbers for the $5 million wire transfer. Barbara browsed real estate listings, picking out the exact oceanfront property she planned to purchase by the weekend. Every single action they took, every dollar of debt they accumulated, was another heavy stone added to the trap they were building for themselves. They were entirely dependent on the illusion holding together for just a few more days. They had bet their entire future, their freedom, and their financial lives on the assumption that I was broken and Leo was gone. Their celebration was the ultimate display of their sociopathy. They felt absolutely no remorse for stealing my business, no guilt for framing me for federal crimes, and no shame for exploiting a grieving grandfather. They only felt the intoxicating rush of unearned power. They thought the game was over. They thought they had won. But the board was about to be flipped. Their forged documents and fake charities were nothing but fragile paper walls, and we were bringing a wrecking ball. The morning sun would soon rise over Los Angeles, bringing with it a reckoning they could not possibly comprehend. The illusion was about to shatter, and their luxurious Bel Air mansion would become the very cage that trapped them. "We will destroy them," Leo had said. And now, standing in the dark hotel room, I knew he was right. They had consumed everything they touched. They had fed on my hard work, on my fear, and on my desperation. Now they were feeding on the grief of a man they had never even met. The sheer audacity of it all was suffocating. I watched the digital clock on the bedside table slowly tick toward dawn. Every minute that passed brought us closer to Arthur's Sterling office. Every minute brought us closer to detonating a bomb right in the middle of their celebration. I imagined Vanessa waking up in her silk sheets, dreaming of her $5 million payout. I imagined Thomas polishing his new Porsche. Let them enjoy their final hours of false victory. Let them rack up thousands more in credit card debt. When the truth came out, the creditors would descend on them like vultures. The federal authorities Thomas had planned to sic on me would instead be knocking down his custom oak doors. The fall from the top is always the hardest, and they had climbed so incredibly high on a ladder made entirely of lies. I closed my eyes, taking a deep breath of the stale motel air. It smelled better than the expensive perfume Vanessa wore. It smelled like freedom. The night was over. It was time to go to war. The morning sun pierced through the thin curtains of the motel room, signaling the start of the most important day of my life. Leo and I dressed in silence. We left the motel and drove his muscle car toward Century City. The towering glass skyscrapers reflected the bright California sky, a stark contrast to the dark reality of what we were about to expose. We parked in the underground garage of an imposing high-rise building and rode the elevator to the top floor. Arthur Sterling Private Law Firm occupied the entire penthouse level. The reception area was an intimidating expanse of white marble and dark wood designed to make visitors feel small. A receptionist in a sharp-tailored suit escorted us to a massive corner office. Arthur Sterling sat behind a desk that looked like it was carved from a single slab of mahogany. He was a man in his late 60s, with silver hair, sharp features, and eyes that missed absolutely nothing. He did not stand to greet us. He simply tapped his expensive gold pen against a leather-bound notepad. Vance tells me you have 15 minutes of my time to explain why I should halt a $5 million charitable transfer. Sterling said, his voice smooth, but laced with impatience. He clearly believed we were just another pair of opportunists, trying to grab a piece of the Montgomery fortune. Let us be efficient, Ms. Haley. I do not entertain conspiracy theories or emotional pleas. I deal strictly in facts and legal liabilities. I did not waste a single second. I reached into my bag and pulled out the thick manila folder I had painstakingly assembled. I placed it directly in the center of his pristine desk. I am not here for an emotional plea. Mr. Sterling? I said, my voice steady and commanding. I am here to stop your client from becoming the victim of a massive, coordinated federal fraud. The woman currently residing in the Montgomery estate is my adoptive sister, Vanessa. The charity she convinced Mr. Montgomery to fund is a fraudulent shell corporation registered by my adoptive father, Thomas. And the death certificate she provided for Mr. Montgomery's grandson is a complete forgery. Sterling stopped tapping his pen. His sharp eyes darted from my face to the folder. He opened it with practiced efficiency. I placed my hand on the first document. That is a certified DNA report from the premier private laboratory in Los Angeles, I explained. The results were expedited and verified late last night. It proves with absolute scientific certainty that the man sitting next to me is the biological grandson of Richard Montgomery. He is alive. He is sitting right here in your office. Sterling looked at the DNA report, then slowly raised his eyes to look at Leo. He scrutinized Leo's face, taking in the dark hair, the strong jawline, and the faint but unmistakable scar just above his left eyebrow. Sterling had been with the Montgomery family for decades. He knew what the missing boy looked like. I could see the gears turning in the ruthless attorney mind as the visual evidence aligned with the scientific data. I pulled out the next stack of papers. These are his original foster care transfer records from Colorado to Illinois, completely contradicting the timeline Vanessa provided. And this, I said, placing a small digital audio recorder on the desk, is a recording of Vanessa and my adoptive mother explicitly discussing their plot to steal my trust fund and exploit my childhood journal to manipulate Mr. Montgomery. I pressed play. The clear, unmistakable sound of Vanessa's arrogant voice filled the quiet office. Sterling listened to her boast about the forged documents and the easy manipulation of the grieving billionaire. He listened to her mock the very concept of the charity she had supposedly founded. The audio was damning. It was the sound of pure, unadulterated extortion. Sterling turned off the recorder. The bored gatekeeper was completely gone. In his place sat a legal predator who had just realized his most important client was actively being robbed by a cartel of sociopaths. He picked up his desk phone and pressed a single button. "Cancel all my morning appointments," he ordered his assistant. "Then find Richard Montgomery. Tell him he needs to come to my office immediately through the private garage entrance. Tell him it is a matter of absolute life and death regarding the estate." We sat in heavy silence for 20 minutes. The gravity of the impending collision hung in the air. Then the heavy oak doors of the office swung open. Richard Montgomery stepped inside. He looked exhausted, leaning heavily on a silver-tipped walking cane. He wore a dark suit, but his shoulders were slumped with the weight of the grief Vanessa had so cruelly manipulated over the past few days. "Arthur, what is the meaning of this?" Richard asked, his voice rough. "I am supposed to be reviewing the final wire transfers for the memorial fund. Why have you brought me here?" Richard looked past the lawyer and finally noticed Leo and me sitting in the guest chairs. His eyes locked onto Leo. The cane slipped from Richard's hand and clattered loudly against the hardwood floor. The billionaire froze, completely paralyzed. The color drained from his face as he stared at the man sitting across from him. He took a slow, trembling step forward. He looked at the scar. He looked at the eyes. He saw the undeniable reflection of his own lost daughter staring back at him. Leo stood up slowly. He did not know how to interact with the world of billionaires, but he knew how to recognize genuine, profound pain. He closed the distance between them. "My name is Leo," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Haley found me in Chicago. I am here. I am alive." Richard let out a sound that was half sob and half gasp. He threw his arms around Leo, pulling him into a desperate, crushing embrace. The powerful, ruthless real estate tycoon broke down completely, weeping onto the shoulder of the mechanic from Chicago. For 20 years he had chased ghosts and dead ends. Now his flesh and blood was standing right in front of him. I watched the reunion with tears blurring my own vision. I had fulfilled my promise. I had brought the protector back to his family. It took several minutes for Richard to regain his composure. When he finally stepped back, wiping his eyes with a silk handkerchief, the profound joy on his face began to mix with a sudden, terrible confusion. "I do not understand," Richard said, looking from Leo to me and then to his lawyer. "Vanessa told me you died. She gave me a certificate. She told me she held you as you passed away. That is why I called you here." Richard Sterling interjected, his voice returning to its sharp professional edge. "You have been the victim of a highly sophisticated, targeted extortion plot. The woman in your house is a fraud. The charity is a money-laundering shell controlled by her father. They fabricated the death certificate to secure the $5 million reward without ever having to produce an actual heir." Sterling walked Richard through the entire dossier of evidence. He showed him the DNA test, the transfer records, and the audio recording. I watched Richard's face transform. The immense grief and the overwhelming relief of finding Leo rapidly hardened into a cold, terrifying wrath. The billionaire realized he had invited parasites into his home. He had funded their luxury shopping sprees. He had allowed them to leverage his deepest trauma for financial gain. Richard reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone. "I am calling the police," he declared, his voice shaking with pure rage. "I am having them all arrested for fraud right this second. I will see them thrown in prison for the rest of their miserable lives." "Wait," I said, stepping forward and placing a hand gently over his phone. "Mr. Montgomery, if you call the police right now, Thomas will hire the best defense attorneys in the city. He will claim he did not know the charity was a shell. He will claim Vanessa acted alone and was genuinely confused by her memories. They will drag this out in court for years, and they will hide behind legal technicalities. They might even try to use those forged financial documents against me to muddy the waters." Richard stopped, looking at me with intense, fierce eyes. "What do you suggest we do, Haley? They cannot be allowed to get away with this. They tried to erase my grandson." "We do not just arrest them," I said, my voice dropping to a calm, calculated register. "We destroy them publicly. We let them build their trap exactly the way they planned, but we change the target at the very last second. We need them to commit grand larceny on camera in front of witnesses they cannot possibly discredit. We need them to sign the fraudulent documents while the whole world is watching." Sterling leaned back in his chair, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his face. "She is right, Richard. If we orchestrate a public execution of their fraud, the federal prosecutors will have an airtight case. No defense attorney in the country will be able to save them." "How do we do it?" Leo asked, crossing his arms. Richard walked over into the large window looking out at the city he had helped build. His posture was no longer slumped. The ruthless tycoon had returned fueled by the protective fury of a grandfather who had just gotten his family back. Vanessa wanted a $5 million payout for a dead boy, Richard said, his voice echoing with absolute authority. So we will give her exactly the stage she desires. I will announce a massive memorial gala for this weekend. I will invite the press, my major business partners, and the elite of Los Angeles society. I will tell Vanessa that I want to honor her incredible bravery by publicly signing the $5 million check and transferring it to her charity in front of the cameras. It is the perfect bait, I agreed, feeling a surge of adrenaline. Thomas and Barbara will not be able to resist the spotlight. They will want to bask in the glory of their successful con. They will show up in their expensive new clothes, ready to claim their stolen fortune. And the moment her pen touches that fraudulent contract, Sterling added, I will have the federal authorities waiting in the wings. Wire fraud, grand larceny, and extortion. We will seize every asset they have. Richard turned to face us, his eyes burning with a terrifying resolve. We will let them walk right up to the finish line. We will let them taste the victory. And then Haley, you and Leo are going to walk through those doors and turn their beautiful gala into a slaughterhouse. We are going to bury them. The grand ballroom of the Millennium Biltmore Hotel was transformed into a staggering shrine of opulent mourning. From my secure vantage point behind the tinted glass of the mezzanine control room, I looked down at the sprawling sea of Los Angeles elite. Crystal chandeliers bathed the massive room in a soft golden light, casting long, elegant shadows across the floor. Towering floral arrangements of white lilies and orchids anchored every table. Orchestral music floated through the air, providing a suitably tragic and majestic soundtrack for the evening. Richard Montgomery did not do things by halves. If he was going to build a trap to catch a family of sociopaths, he was going to build it out of solid gold and surround it with 1,000 witnesses. Reporters from major local and national news networks had their cameras set up along the velvet-roped perimeter of the room. Wealthy socialites, prominent politicians, and ruthless business moguls were sipping expensive champagne, exchanging hushed whispers about the tragic backstory of the generous billionaire and the brave orphan girl. I stood next to Leo in the darkened observation room. He wore a tailored black suit that Richard had specifically provided for this night. He looked every inch the billionaire heir, though his hands were still rough and calloused from years of turning wrenches in a Chicago garage. Arthur Sterling stood behind us, checking his gold pocket watch with mechanical precision, while two undercover federal agents waited silently in the adjacent corridor. The atmosphere in our small room was thick with crackling electric anticipation. The heavy double doors of the ballroom swung open, and the guests of honor made their grand entrance. Thomas, Barbara, and Vanessa walked into the room as if they owned the entire city. I felt a cold surge of disgust wash over me as I watched them navigate the crowd. Thomas wore a custom-tailored tuxedo, his posture radiating a sickening, unearned superiority. He actually had the audacity to casually hand his valet ticket for his unpaid Porsche to the hotel manager with a condescending flick of his wrist. Barbara was wrapped tightly in a dark designer gown, a thick, heavy diamond necklace resting prominently against her collarbone. They were flaunting wealth they did not possess, spending money they had not yet stolen. And then there was Vanessa. She wore a stunning, understated black dress perfectly tailored to make her look both flawlessly elegant and appropriately somber. She had styled her hair to look effortlessly tragic, pulling it back into a simple, elegant clasp. She clutched a small designer clutch to her chest, putting on a masterclass performance of the humble grieving friend. I watched through the high-definition security monitors as they mingled with the crowd. Thomas was already handing out premium business cards, leveraging his fake charity to network with real estate developers and venture capitalists. He was laying the groundwork for his next series of frauds. Barbara was soaking up the sympathy of wealthy wives, dabbing at her completely dry eyes with a lace handkerchief. They were absolutely intoxicated by their own lies, entirely convinced of their superior intellect. Richard Montgomery stood near the main stage, playing his part flawlessly. He was the ultimate bait. He looked frail, intentionally leaning heavily on his silver-tipped cane, his eyes cast downward in performative sorrow. When Vanessa approached him, she placed a comforting, highly visible hand on his arm, making sure the press cameras captured the moment. Richard patted her hand in return, a masterful display of iron restraint, considering he knew this exact woman was actively trying to rob him and had callously declared his living grandson dead just days prior. The orchestral music slowly faded into silence, replaced by the sharp, commanding tap of a microphone. Arthur Sterling stepped onto the stage, his face a perfect mask of legal neutrality. He welcomed the distinguished guests, thanking them for attending this momentous occasion to honor the creation of the Leo Montgomery Memorial Fund. The massive crowd fell completely silent, hanging on his every word. Sterling then formally introduced Vanessa to the stage. The applause from the audience was polite, respectful, and deeply sympathetic. Vanessa walked up the carpeted steps, her head bowed at just the right angle to convey humility. She took her place behind the polished wooden podium. She looked out at the massive audience of billionaires and reporters, took a deep, trembling breath, and began the most despicable performance of her life. She spoke about the freezing, brutal winters in Colorado. She spoke about the dark, terrifying hallways of the orphanage. My blood boiled as she stole my exact memories, my exact words directly from the pages of my stolen journal, and delivered them with chilling, calculated precision. She described how she and Leo used to hide behind the boiler room to escape the cruel caretakers. She described his supposed bravery, his fierce loyalty to her. She paused at all the right moments to let out a perfectly calibrated, heartbreaking sob. I watched Leo face as he listened to this absolute stranger exploit our deeply personal childhood trauma. His jaw was clenched so tight the muscles in his neck strained visibly. He stared down through the tinted glass, his hands balled into tight fists at his sides. Vanessa was taking the darkest, most vulnerable moments of our survival and twisting them into a theatrical script for her own financial gain. Vanessa then seamlessly transitioned to the horrific lie regarding the fake death. She described her agonizing, lifelong search for her protector. She detailed how she had finally tracked him down using private investigators, only to discover he had died in a tragic, fatal car accident many years ago. She looked directly down at Richard Montgomery, who was seated in the front row, and told him how much Leo would have loved him, how much he would have cherished a grandfather. The sheer staggering sociopathy required to look a grieving man in the eye and deliver a fabricated death story about his own flesh and blood was beyond human comprehension. Barbara and Thomas sat in the front row holding hands, acting like the proudest, most loving and supportive parents in the entire world. Barbara wiped fake tears from her cheeks, while Thomas nodded solemnly at the crowd playing the role of the steadfast patriarch. They were soaking in the adulation, feeding on the tragic narrative they had engineered. Vanessa finished her speech to a thunderous standing ovation. People in the wealthy audience were actually pulling out handkerchiefs and wiping away genuine tears. She stepped down from the podium, wiping her eyes delicately. Richard Montgomery stood up from his front row seat. He walked slowly up the stage stairs, refusing assistance. A large, polished ceremonial table was rolled out to the very center of the stage, directly under the brightest spotlights. On the table rested a heavy leather-bound legal contract and a massive, oversized ceremonial check made out for exactly $5 million payable directly to the charitable foundation Thomas completely controlled. Richard took the microphone, his voice echoing loudly across the silent ballroom. He spoke briefly about the importance of legacy, about honoring those we have lost, and about turning profound tragedy into profound hope. He spoke about the generosity of the human spirit. Then he turned directly to Vanessa. He formally invited her and her parents to the stage to officially sign the transfer documents and accept the donation. Thomas and Barbara practically leaped from their seats, their unadulterated greed propelling them forward. They stood proudly flanking Vanessa as Richard handed her a heavy, solid gold fountain pen. The press cameras flashed blindingly, lighting up the stage in a rapid-fire sequence of bright white bursts. The entire room watched in breathless, hushed anticipation. Vanessa stepped up to the table. She leaned over the leather-bound contract, her manicured fingers gripping the gold pen. The tip of the pen hovered just a fraction of an inch above the signature line. In her mind, She had already won. She was milliseconds away from securing the $5 million payout that would fund her luxury lifestyle, her mother new mansion, and her father new sports car. She was milliseconds away from cementing the lie forever. In the corridor just outside our observation room, the two federal agents stepped closer to the door, their hands resting near their communication radios. Down on the stage, Arthur Sterling looked up from his position and made direct eye contact with our control room window. The trap was fully primed. The bait was taken. The predators were standing exactly where we wanted them, entirely surrounded by cameras and federal witnesses. I reached out and placed my hand on the heavy brass handle of the observation room door, ready to completely shatter their illusion. The moment Vanessa Gold fountain pen hovered mere millimeters above the signature line of the massive ceremonial check, I pushed the brass handle down. The heavy double doors of the Millennium Biltmore Grand Ballroom swung open with a resounding thud that echoed like a gunshot across the silent, expectant crowd. I stepped through the threshold, Leo right beside me. We did not walk quickly. We walked with the slow, measured pace of absolute executioners. The entire ballroom turned to look at us. Hundreds of wealthy guests, powerful executives, and seasoned journalists froze, their champagne flutes hovering midway to their lips. The silence was absolute, heavy, and suffocating. Vanessa froze on the stage, her pen suspended in midair. She looked up, and the smug, triumphant smile melted off her face faster than ice hitting a hot stove. She stared at me, her eyes wide with a terror so profound it almost looked comical. She recognized me despite my simple black dress, and then her eyes shifted to the man walking beside me. She did not know Leo Face, but she knew what his presence meant. Barbara and Thomas twisted around in their front row seats. Barbara dropped her lace handkerchief to the floor. Thomas half stood up, his face draining of all color as he recognized the man whose death he had just fabricated. "Stop the signing!" I called out, my voice ringing clear and steady across the massive room. "That woman is committing massive federal fraud." A collective gasp rippled through the audience. Camera flashes began to pop, a frantic staccato of bright white bursts, illuminating the sudden chaos. Arthur Sterling stepped forward from his position near Richard Montgomery. He did not look surprised. He looked like a wolf about to strike. He raised a hand, signaling the audio-visual technicians in the back of the room. Vanessa dropped the gold pen. It clattered against the polished mahogany table and rolled onto the floor. "Security!" she shrieked, her voice shrill and panicked. "Get them out of here! This woman is a dangerous stalker. She is having a psychotic break." The security guards lining the perimeter of the room did not move a single muscle. They had their orders directly from Arthur Sterling and Richard Montgomery. They stood like statues, watching the trap spring shut. Leo did not wait for an invitation. He walked straight down the center aisle, ignoring the murmurs of the crowd, and climbed the steps to the stage. He did not look at Vanessa. He looked directly out at the sea of bewildered faces and then at the bank of news cameras. "My name is Leo Montgomery," he said, taking the microphone from a stunned Arthur Sterling. "I am the biological grandson of Richard Montgomery, and the woman standing behind me is a complete fraud." The ballroom erupted into chaos. Reporters began shouting questions, shoving their microphones forward. Guests murmured in shocked disbelief. Barbara screamed from the front row, denying everything, her voice cracking with desperation. Thomas realized the trap had sprung. He lunged toward the stage, his face contorted in panic, trying to reach Vanessa and somehow salvage the situation. But the two undercover federal agents who had been waiting in the corridor stepped out from the shadows, intercepting him before he could reach the stairs. They blocked his path, their badges clearly visible. Vanessa backed away from Leo, her hands trembling. "You are lying," she stammered, pointing a shaking finger at him. "You are an imposter. You read about me online. You read my journal." Leo turned to face her, a cold, hard smile playing on his lips. "Your journal?" He repeated the words, dripping with contempt. "You mean the journal you stole from Haley apartment 3 days ago? The journal you used to memorize my childhood trauma so you could exploit my grieving grandfather for a $5 million payout?" "It is my journal," Vanessa screamed, losing her composure completely. "I lived in that orphanage. I was the one who hid behind the boiler room." "Then tell me what the third symbol means." Leo challenged his voice, dropping to a dangerous whisper. Vanessa froze. The third symbol, she repeated, her eyes darting around frantically as she tried to recall the pages she had hastily memorized in the back of a luxury car. The third symbol was a star. It meant danger. It meant we had to run. I walked up the stage stairs, stopping right next to Leo. I looked down at the massive crowd and then directly into the main television camera broadcasting live to the local news stations. The third symbol was a triangle with a dot in the center. I said, my voice steady and unwavering. But you would not know that, Vanessa, because you only read the decoy journal. I reached into my purse and pulled out a small, weathered leather book, identical to the one Vanessa had stolen. I held it up for the entire room to see. When I was 12 years old, I explained, my voice echoing through the silent ballroom. I realized my adoptive family was systematically going through my personal belongings, so I bought 2 identical journals. I wrote my real memories, my real codes in this one. I kept it hidden under a loose floorboard. The one Vanessa stole from my desk drawer, the one she memorized to build her fake identity, was a decoy. It contained deliberately altered details, altered codes, altered dates. Vanessa's face turned a sickening shade of gray. She realized she had walked into a trap constructed years ago by a paranoid 12-year-old girl trying to protect her only memories from an abusive family. I deliberately wrote that the third symbol meant danger. I continued turning to face Vanessa, but the real symbol, the one Leo drew on my hand the night before I was adopted, meant forever protected. And you did not know that because you were never there. You never knew him. You just stole my trauma to steal his money. Arthur Sterling stepped up to the podium, signaling the technicians again. The massive projection screen behind the stage flickered to life. Ladies and gentlemen, Sterling announced, his voice cutting through the stunned murmurs of the crowd. The woman standing before you is Vanessa Vance. She and her parents, Thomas and Barbara Vance, have orchestrated one of the most audacious extortion plots I have seen in my 40-year career. The screen illuminated, displaying high-resolution images of the forged documents. This is the death certificate Ms. Vance provided to my client. Sterling continued, using a laser pointer to highlight the discrepancies. As you can see, the attending physician's signature is a known forgery. The hospital listed on the document closed 10 years prior to the alleged date of death. The crowd gasped collectively. Reporters scribbled furiously in their notebooks. The screen changed, displaying the registration documents for the Leo Montgomery Memorial Fund. And this, Sterling said, his voice ringing with righteous legal fury, is the charitable foundation Ms. Vance established to receive the $5 million donation. A foundation registered just 4 days ago in Delaware. The sole beneficiary and managing director of this fund is her father, Thomas Vance. Thomas struggled against the federal agents, his face purple with rage. It is a lie, he shouted desperately. She set us up. Haley forged those documents to ruin us. I do not have access to your offshore accounts, Thomas, I said, leaning into the microphone. But the federal investigators do. Sterling nodded to the technicians. The screen shifted one final time, displaying the massive convoluted shadow ledger Thomas had created to frame me. For the past 5 years, Sterling explained, Thomas Vance has been using his position as a financial guarantor to systematically embezzle funds through Ms. Haley Cleaning Company, Elite Estate Care. He created a shadow ledger to frame her for massive federal tax evasion, attempting to use these fabricated crimes to blackmail her into silence regarding his daughter's fraudulent identity theft. The evidence was overwhelming, undeniable, and projected in massive letters for the entire Los Angeles elite to see. The perfect aristocratic facade of the Vance family was completely obliterated. They were exposed as common thieves, extortionists, and frauds. Barbara collapsed onto the carpeted floor of the ballroom, sobbing hysterically, her designer pearls clattering against the floor. She pointed a shaking finger at Thomas. It was his idea, she wailed desperately, trying to save herself. He forced us to do it. He said it was foolproof. He said we needed the money. Thomas stared at his wife, his expression a mixture of profound betrayal and absolute fury. You greedy, pathetic coward, he spat, struggling against the agents. You spent half that money in your head before the ink was even dry. Vanessa stood frozen on the stage, completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of her exposure. The cameras continued to flash, capturing her humiliation from every conceivable angle. She looked at Richard Montgomery, who was sitting quietly in the front row, his hands resting on his silver-tipped cane, his expression a mask of cold, unforgiving judgment. She looked at me, her eyes wide with a desperate, pleading panic. "Haley, please," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Please, you cannot do this. We are sisters." I stepped closer to her, lowering my voice, so only she could hear. "We were never sisters, Vanessa. I was just the girl you threw the wine at. I was just the girl you locked out in the cold. You thought you could steal my past and sell it. You thought you could bury me in a federal prison." I turned back to the microphone, my voice echoing across the silent, shattered ballroom. "You told me to find another family, Vanessa. So I did. And my new family brought the FBI." The federal agents moved with terrifying efficiency. The sharp metallic click of handcuffs echoed through the silent ballroom, slicing through the tension like a blade. Thomas was the very first to fall. An undercover agent grabbed his shoulder and shoved him aggressively against the polished mahogany table, forcing his arms violently behind his back. The arrogant patriarch, who just moments ago believed he was successfully orchestrating the perfect crime, now writhed helplessly against the cold hardwood floor. His custom-tailored tuxedo wrinkled and tore as he shouted rapid obscenities, demanding to call his expensive corporate lawyers and threatening everyone in the room with massive lawsuits. The federal agents ignored his frantic protests entirely, reading him his Miranda rights in a flat, clinical tone that stripped him of all his perceived power. Barbara was the next to collapse. The grand illusion of the grieving philanthropic mother shattered into a million jagged pieces right in front of the flashing news cameras. She scrambled backward on her hands and knees, her designer dress tangling around her legs, while the heavy diamond necklace swung violently against her chest. She pointed a trembling, accusatory finger directly at her own husband. She screamed hysterically that she knew absolutely nothing about the forged documents or the fake charities. She wailed that Thomas had viciously forced her and Vanessa into this illegal scheme, claiming that he was a tyrant who controlled their finances and manipulated their every move. Her desperate, pathetic attempt to throw her own husband under the bus just to save her own skin disgusted the entire audience. The wealthy socialites who had offered her their deepest, heartfelt sympathies just an hour ago now stared at her with pure, unadulterated revulsion. The Golden family facade was completely dead. Vanessa was undoubtedly the loudest and most unhinged of them all. When the female federal agent firmly grabbed her arm to apply the steel cuffs, Vanessa completely lost her mind. She shrieked at the top of her lungs, kicking her designer heels and thrashing wildly like a feral animal trapped in a snare. Her perfectly styled hair fell into a messy, tangled bird nest around her tear-stained face, ruining her tragic orphan aesthetic. She screamed directly at the billionaire, begging him to look at her, swearing that she really loved him like a true grandfather, and that my diary was actually hers. Richard Montgomery did not even blink. He looked down at her with eyes as cold and unforgiving as a brutal winter storm. Realizing the billionaire was immune to her manipulation, Vanessa then turned her toxic venom toward me. She spat vicious, ugly insults across the stage, promising to destroy my life the second she got out on bail. She screamed that I was nothing but a worthless street rat who had ruined her perfect destiny. She did not realize that there would be absolutely no bail for a flight risk facing decades of federal charges. Arthur Sterling stepped back up to the microphone, his commanding voice easily cutting through Vanessa, frantic shrieking, and the chaotic murmurs of the crowd. He informed the room and the live television broadcast cameras that the federal authorities had already executed a sweeping freeze on every single bank account associated with the Vance family, because they had attempted to commit severe wire fraud across state lines and utilized fraudulent charities to launder illicit money. The government had authorized an immediate, uncompromising seizure of all their material assets. Sterling announced with a cold, satisfying smirk that the magnificent midnight black Porsche that Thomas had purchased just hours ago was currently being impounded by federal marshals in the circular driveway right outside the hotel. The custom designer gown Vanessa was wearing, the heavy diamonds around Barbara's neck, the luxury watches, and the extravagant Bel Air mansion itself were all heavily financed by massive, unsecured lines of credit. Credit that was secured solely by the false promise of a $5 million charitable payout that would now never arrive. Sterling proudly announced that the major banking institutions had already been notified of the extensive fraud. The creditors were already descending upon the family like a swarm of hungry locusts. In the span of roughly 5 chaotic minutes, the Vance family had gone from pretending to be Los Angeles aristocracy to being absolutely and unequivocally bankrupt. They had negative millions in unpayable debt and were facing decades in a federal penitentiary. The hotel security guards and the armed federal agents forcefully dragged them down the long center aisle of the ballroom. The rapid-fire flashing cameras captured their glorious downfall from every possible humiliating angle. The high-definition footage of Thomas being hauled away in tight handcuffs, Barbara sobbing hysterically on the dirty carpet, and Vanessa screaming like a lunatic would be broadcast on every major news network across the entire country before the night was over. They were completely ruined, stripped of their wealth, their freedom, and their dignity. As the heavy double doors of the ballroom swung shut behind the disgraced family, the suffocating tension in the massive room instantly evaporated. The stunned silence was suddenly broken by a spontaneous wave of deafening applause. It did not start from Richard Montgomery or Arthur Sterling. It started directly from the audience. The powerful executives, prominent politicians, and wealthy guests clapped enthusiastically, not for a tragic orphan story, but for the swift, brutal delivery of absolute justice. Richard walked slowly over to me, leaning heavily on his silver-tipped cane. The harsh, ruthless demeanor he had worn to successfully spring the trap melted away completely, revealing a man who had just had his fractured soul miraculously restored. He reached out and pulled me into a tight, genuine embrace. He thanked me with tears in his eyes. He thanked me for protecting his grandson in the freezing halls of the Colorado Orphanage, and he thanked me for risking my own freedom and safety to protect his family legacy today. He then turned his attention to Leo. The billionaire tycoon and the Chicago mechanic stood face to face under the bright stage lights. There was absolutely no awkwardness and no hesitation between them. They belonged to each other. Richard formally introduced Leo to the cheering crowd, not as a tragic memory, but as the living, breathing future of the Montgomery Empire. The fake memorial gala seamlessly transformed into the most spectacular homecoming celebration in the history of the city. Later that evening, after the eager press had been escorted out and the ballroom was filled only with trusted friends and essential business partners, Richard pulled me aside into a quiet private alcove. He told me that he had personally ordered his extensive legal team to obliterate the shadow ledger Thomas had maliciously created. My name was completely cleared of any fabricated embezzlement charges, and my frozen accounts were fully restored. But Richard did not stop there. He pulled a pristine, embossed leather folder from his tailored jacket pocket and handed it directly to me. He explained that a person with my exceptional level of intelligence, unwavering loyalty, and fierce determination was exactly the kind of person he desperately wanted running his properties. He was officially offering to buy a 50% ownership stake in Elite Estate Care for $10 million. Furthermore, he was integrating my cleaning company directly into the massive Montgomery Real Estate Holdings portfolio. I would not just be a business owner anymore. I would be the official president of the largest, most exclusive luxury property management network on the entire West Coast, with unlimited capital and resources at my disposal. My jaw dropped as I stared at the incredible contract, realizing my life had forever changed. Several weeks passed. The intense chaos of the gala faded into the highly productive rhythm of my brand new life. I stood proudly on the expansive private balcony of Richard Montgomery penthouse, the cool evening breeze sweeping gently through my hair. The glittering Los Angeles skyline stretched out endlessly before me, a brilliant ocean of lights and limitless possibilities. I was no longer the exhausted, desperate cleaning woman scrubbing floors just to survive. I wore a perfectly tailored power suit, commanding an empire that I had built with my own hands and secured with my own courage. Elite Estate Care had quadrupled in size within a single month, and my new executive office was located in the top tier of the Montgomery Tower. Leo walked out onto the balcony wearing a crisp, dark suit that fit his broad shoulders perfectly, looking every inch the powerful billionaire heir he was born to be. He stood beside me, completing our loyal circle. I pulled my smartphone from my jacket pocket. I opened my contacts list and highlighted the names I had feared for 25 years. Thomas, Barbara, Vanessa. I pressed the delete button, removing them from my phone, my life and my future permanently. I smiled warmly and embraced my new empire. The frightened orphan was gone forever, and the true queen had arrived.